Tonight, we're venturing deep into the haunted heart of Texas, a place where every shadow hides a story, and every whisper in the wind could be something that never left. From ghostly towns lost to time to desolate roads where headlights vanish without a trace, these are 20 true haunted places in Texas you should never visit after dark. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one crucial mistake. They watch these stories in the dark, but forget to subscribe. And by doing that, they miss out on the most chilling, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now, because tonight's just the beginning and what's waiting beyond these stories is far from over. So tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Because when it comes to these places, the time and the darkness both matter. Now, let's dive into the darkness. I grew up on the south side of San Antonio, not far from a stretch of old railroad tracks that everyone in town seemed to know. They cut through a quiet neighborhood, half swallowed by weeds and silence. I never thought much of them as a kid. They were just part of the background, like the sound of cicadas at dusk or the smell of hot asphalt after rain. But everyone knew the stories. If your car stalled on those tracks late at night, the ghosts of children killed there decades ago would push you to safety. My friends used to talk about it like it was a local carnival trick. They'd sprinkle baby powder on their bumpers, drive out there at midnight and swear they saw little handprints appear afterward. I never joined them. Back then, I figured it was just something bored teenagers invented to scare each other. Years later, after I came back from college, I drove past the area again. The neighborhood had changed. The roads were cracked, streetlights flickered, and most of the houses looked half abandoned. But the tracks were still there, cutting across Shane Road like a scar that never healed. It was close to midnight when I passed by, and out of habit I slowed down. I hadn't thought of those stories in years, but something about the empty road and the faint red glow of my taillights made me stop. The rational part of me said it was nonsense, but another part, the part that still believed in childhood whispers, wanted to know. So I put the car in neutral, right on the rails, and let it sit there. The night was dead quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of a cricket. I waited for something, anything. Nothing happened. After a few seconds, I felt ridiculous. I was a grown man waiting for ghosts to push my car. I was about to shift gears when my headlights flickered. The radio hissed with static, and for a brief moment the air inside the car felt heavy, like every bit of oxygen had been sucked out. Then I felt movement. It wasn't a jolt or a bump, it was smoother, almost gentle. The car began to roll forward, uphill. My foot wasn't on the pedal. I stared out the windshield as the car crept across the tracks. My heart hammered against my ribs, every logical thought in my head dissolving into panic. The dashboard lights dimmed, and through the rearview mirror I thought I saw shadows behind me. Small shapes, blurred, child-sized outlines standing in the middle of the tracks. I blinked hard and they were gone. The car rolled until it reached the other side, then came to a stop as if someone had quietly set it down. The moment I touched the gear shift, everything snapped back to normal. The radio returned to music, the lights brightened, and the air felt breathable again. I drove home shaking. I didn't look back once. That night I told myself it had to be the incline, the angle of the road, maybe even wind pressure. But something deep down refused to accept that. My hands were still trembling when I reached my driveway. I sat there for a long time, just staring at my bumper in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see much in the dark, but part of me didn't want to check. When I finally got out and looked, the back of my car was covered in a faint white film from road dust. And smeared into that dust were what looked like handprints. Small, clear, and dozens of them. I didn't tell anyone. It felt too strange, too unreal. I convinced myself it was coincidence. For a week I avoided that side of town, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. The more I tried not to think about it, the more it pulled at me. By the end of the month, I drove back there, this time with my cousin Mark, who was the kind of person who never believed in anything. We went late, just past 1 in the morning. The neighborhood was silent again, but that night there was fog crawling low along the ground. We parked a few yards from the crossing, killed the headlights, and waited. Mark laughed the whole time, cracking jokes about ghost kids and how bored they must be. After a few minutes of nothing, he decided to test it himself. He backed the car onto the tracks, left the engine idling, and said, "All right, let's see if your little friends show up." We sat there, listening to the steady rumble of the motor. A minute passed, then two. The silence pressed in again, thick and uncomfortable. I was about to tell him to stop when I noticed something. Movement in the fog behind the car. It wasn't the shifting mist. It was shapes. Shadows that didn't belong to us. They stood just beyond the reach of the taillights, still and quiet. "Do you see that?" I asked. Mark leaned forward to look, but before he could answer, the car rocked slightly, as if someone had leaned against it from behind. The engine revved on its own, lights flickering. Then it began to move slowly but steadily forward. Mark let go of the wheel, and we both watched in disbelief as the car rolled uphill again. The fog parted around us, and for a split second I saw them clearly. 6 or 7 children, standing shoulder to shoulder along the tracks. Their faces were pale and blurred, their eyes wide open, black against the glow of the brake lights. I yelled for Mark to drive. He threw the car into gear, and the engine screamed as we sped off the incline. When we reached the other side, I turned to look back, but there was nothing there. No fog, no figures, just the still, empty railroad crossing behind us. We didn't speak until we got back onto the main road. Mark's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Did you see their faces?" he whispered. I nodded. Neither of us said another word. When we pulled into his driveway, I got out and walked around to the back. The bumper was clean when we'd left, but now there were new smudges. More handprints. The strange thing was, some were darker than dust. They looked burned into the paint, as if whoever or whatever had touched it, left a mark hotter than fire. After that night, Mark refused to talk about it. Within weeks, he moved out of San Antonio. I didn't blame him, but I stayed. I still drive those roads, though I always take the long way around when I have to pass near Shane Road. Every once in a while, I catch myself glancing toward that crossing, just to see if the lights are still blinking red in the dark. Last month, a local paper ran a story about vandals tearing up parts of the old tracks. They quoted a city worker who said they found something buried underneath. A rusted school bus door, still marked with the district's logo. There were scratch marks along the inside, like dozens of small hands had tried to claw their way out. The city sealed the area the next day, claiming safety concerns. But people who live nearby say they can still hear the sound of metal scraping against gravel at night, followed by faint voices, high-pitched and panicked, crying for help. Sometimes when I drive home late and hit a red light, I swear I hear the faint sound of a train whistle. The city hasn't run trains on those tracks for years. It's always faint, distant, like it's just beyond hearing. But when it happens, I can't help glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see tiny handprints forming in the dust again. I never do. Not yet, anyway. But I keep my engine running every time I pass those tracks, because part of me still believes they're out there, waiting to help the next fool who stalls in the dark. In Palo Pinto County, Texas, there used to be a squat stone building that sat off Highway 180, half swallowed by mesquite and cedar trees. People driving through at night would glance toward it and quicken their speed, even though the jailhouse had been abandoned for decades. Locals said that if you drove by with your windows down, you could hear the metal bars clanging from inside, echoing through the emptiness like the ghosts of a time when men screamed their last prayers in that place. The county demolished what remained of it in 1998, but that didn't end anything. In some ways, it only made things worse. I first heard about the old jail from my uncle, who worked for the Palo Pinto County maintenance crew back in the 80s. He told me how he'd been called to clean out the building after the last sheriff moved the prisoners to a new facility. The cells were coated in rust and graffiti marked every inch of the walls. But what stayed with him wasn't what he saw, it was what he heard. He swore that while sweeping one of the hallways, he heard someone whisper his name right next to his ear. The building was empty, the power shut off. When he turned, he saw a single cell door swinging open and shut, over and over, though there was no wind inside. He quit the next day. I never forgot that story. Years later, in 2017, I moved back to Mineral Wells, just 15 miles east of where that jail once stood. The land where it used to be was sold to a construction company that planned to build a small warehouse. I'd drive past the lot almost every day on my way home. It was mostly flat now, overgrown with tall weeds, but you could still see where the stone foundation had once been. Something about that place drew my attention every single time. I'd slow down, look toward the field, and feel an uneasy pressure in my chest, like the air around it was heavier somehow. In October that year, A group of local teens filmed a short ghost hunt there. It showed up on YouTube. Grainy footage, laughing voices, a shaky camera pointed toward the spot where the jail used to stand. They only lasted about 10 minutes before something startled them. The video ended abruptly after a loud bang and what sounded like someone shouting in pain. The comments blew up. Some said they heard voices whispering under the static. Others claimed to hear someone crying for help. 2 weeks later, one of those boys went missing. His name was Danny Carter. They found his car abandoned near the river. Keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked. He was never seen again. I tried to forget about it, but that story sat in the back of my mind like a splinter. Early last year, curiosity got the better of me. I'd been doing freelance photography around Palo Pinto and wanted to document forgotten places. Old churches, bridges, roadside diners that hadn't served coffee in decades. I told myself I'd stop by the lot where the jail used to be just before sunset to take some photos. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. When I got there, the place was quiet in that strange way rural Texas gets quiet after dusk. The air felt thick and even the cicadas had gone silent. The weeds were shoulder high, and pieces of broken foundation still jutted from the ground like old teeth. I stepped carefully through, brushing away thorns and bits of wire. I noticed something right away. The air smelled faintly of metal, like rust and old blood. It was such a distinct scent that it made my stomach twist. I raised my camera and started shooting. That's when I heard it. A metallic clank, distant but sharp. I froze. It came again, slow, deliberate, like a door closing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe some old scrap metal shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. The trees stood perfectly still. I lifted my flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. For a moment I thought I saw something, a figure standing near the far end of the lot just beyond the light's reach. But when I blinked, it was gone. I should have left then, but instead, I took another few steps forward, drawn by that same strange pull I'd felt every time I passed this place. My boot hit something solid, a piece of rebar or metal. I knelt to move it and saw the outline of what looked like a trap door made of rotting wood, half buried in the dirt. My heart started pounding. I used the edge of my tripod to pry it up. Underneath was a narrow opening, and below that, a set of stone steps leading into pitch darkness. There shouldn't have been anything left underground. The county had demolished everything, or so I thought. I hesitated, then turned on my camera's flashlight mode and pointed it downward. The walls were stone, slick with moisture. A few steps down, the air grew colder. My breath fogged. I could hear something faint, dripping water maybe. I called out softly just to see if my voice would echo. It didn't. The sound was swallowed instantly, like the dark absorbed it. At the bottom, there was a corridor. The smell hit me first. Rot, mildew, and something else underneath it. Something human. My flashlight flickered, then steadied. The hallway ended at a rusted metal door, its paint peeling in long strips. Across it, faint words were scrawled in white chalk. No release. I remember standing there for what felt like forever, staring at those words, trying to understand what they meant. Then from behind the door, I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Breathing. Slow and labored, like someone asleep or pretending to be. I ran. I don't remember the climb back up. I just remember bursting out into the night air, gasping, shaking so hard I could barely stand. I left everything, tripod, flashlight, even the camera bag. I drove straight home and locked the doors. I didn't sleep that night or the next. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back a few days later, the trapdoor was gone. The dirt had been packed flat like it had never been disturbed. A month after that, I got a call from a sheriff's deputy I knew. He said a construction crew had started clearing that lot again, and one of the workers had been taken to the hospital. They'd been using a backhoe when the ground collapsed beneath it. The driver broke his leg, but that wasn't what scared them. The pit they'd uncovered contained old bricks, rusted chains, and a single metal bed frame, just sitting there in the dirt like someone had been living down there not long ago. The sheriff said they were still figuring out what to do with it. A week later, the project was halted indefinitely. Since then, every now and then, people passing that stretch of road report hearing metal slamming. Some say they hear faint voices calling out from the field at night, echoing through the mesquite trees. A few even claim to have seen lights moving below the ground, like lanterns flickering under the soil. No one stays long enough to check. I still drive past that spot sometimes. I try not to, but my route always leads me there. Last week I slowed down again, glancing toward the field as I passed. The grass had grown taller, and the dirt mounds from the construction had started to erode. But I swear, in the middle of that empty patch of land, I saw something. Just for a second. A doorway, half open, light spilling from inside. Then it vanished. I don't tell people what I saw. Most of them wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know this. When the county tore down that jailhouse, they didn't erase what was built there. They just unburied something older. Something that was never meant to be released. In the desert west of El Paso, where the wind drags the sand across the ground like whispering ghosts and the sky burns orange before dying into black, there stands a chapel that no one claims. The locals call it La Capilla Sangrante, the Bleeding Chapel. It sits about a mile off a cracked service road that used to connect to an old mining route. No one built anything near it anymore, and most maps stopped marking it decades ago. Its wood has gone gray, its cross leans slightly, and every Good Friday without fail, the crucifix above its altar begins to drip blood. No one dares to clean it. No one even dares to enter after sundown. I first heard about it from my uncle, a truck driver who'd run the border routes for most of his life. He told me stories during late nights at family barbecues, half drunk, voice low. He said one Easter weekend, a friend of his pulled over near there to rest, and by morning his rig's windshield was smeared with bloody handprints from the inside. He quit driving the next week. I thought it was the kind of story old men tell to scare kids, but when I moved to El Paso for work, I found that even the people at the diner near Socorro lowered their voices if you mentioned it. There was a weight in the air when they said the name. Some would cross themselves, others would just say, "Don't go there." Curiosity always had a way of getting me in trouble. I'd been photographing abandoned buildings and forgotten churches for a small side project, and the more people avoided talking about the chapel, the more I wanted to see it. I found rough coordinates online, posted years ago by an urban explorer forum that had since gone dead. And one Friday afternoon, I packed my camera, a flashlight, and enough water to last a day. The drive took about 40 minutes from central El Paso, then another 15 down a narrowing dirt road flanked by dry brush and skeletal yucca plants. The air smelled like dust and copper. Around 6 in the evening, I saw the chapel for the first time. It was smaller than I'd imagined, just one rectangular building with a rotted steeple and a rusted bell hanging like a dead tooth. The door was warped but still standing, the kind that swelled and creaked when pushed. The windows were slats of cracked stained glass, their colors long drained by the sun. Above the arched doorway was a simple cross carved into the wood, and streaks of something dark ran down from it like dried tears. I parked a few yards away, killed the engine, and the silence fell thick. No birds, no insects, only wind. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The pews were splintered and uneven. Candles long melted into pale puddles littered the floor, and at the far end stood the altar, beneath a wooden crucifix almost 6 feet tall. The figure of Christ was carved with rough but desperate detail, his head tilted, mouth open as if gasping. There were stains beneath his ribs, stains that looked too dark to be old wood rot. I raised my camera, took a few shots, but something about the place made my hands unsteady. The silence felt alive. I could hear the faint creak of the wooden beams even though there was no wind inside. I walked up to the altar, close enough to touch the base of the crucifix. The wood felt cold. And that's when I saw it, the faint glisten on the ribs, a single bead of red forming at the edge of the wound, slow as a tear, rolling down and dripping onto the altar cloth. I froze. I thought maybe it was rust from an old nail or something in the wood sap, but the drop spread when it hit, deep red, and another formed above it. I lifted my flashlight and saw more, tiny lines of crimson beginning to trace down the carved body. It was happening right in front of me. My throat went dry. My first instinct was to back away, but I couldn't stop staring. The bleeding wasn't gushing, but it was steady, almost deliberate. I heard something behind me, just a shuffle, soft like a foot dragging across wood. I spun around and shone the light, but the pews were empty. I called out, half expecting to hear an animal scurry, but nothing answered. The silence had a pulse to it now. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. I looked back at the crucifix, and that's when I saw the altar cloth moving. The drops of blood had formed small streaks across it, running toward the edge as if being drawn to something unseen. It didn't soak, it flowed, thin as veins, toward the cracks in the wood floor. And from those cracks, faintly, I could hear a sound, something wet, almost like breathing. I stumbled back, knocking over an old pew. The crash echoed like thunder in that small space. My heart was pounding, and I was done trying to rationalize it. I turned for the door and pulled, but the wood caught. I slammed my shoulder against it, and it finally gave. The air outside hit me like a wave of heat. The sun was low now, turning the sand red. I didn't even look back. I got in the car, started it, and didn't stop driving until I saw the glow of El Paso lights in the distance. That night I couldn't sleep. My photos were still on the camera, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that slow drop of blood forming again and again. Around midnight, I gave in and looked through them. The first few were normal, just the chapel exterior, the pews, the altar. But when I reached the close-ups of the crucifix, I stopped breathing. In one frame, behind the cross, barely visible in the darkness, there was a figure. Not a trick of light. A figure in black robes standing near the back corner, head slightly tilted. Its face wasn't visible, just the suggestion of hollow space. I knew it hadn't been there when I took the picture. I would have seen it. The next morning I deleted the photos. I told myself it was dust or pareidolia, or my mind trying to fill shapes in the dark. But 2 days later, I woke up to a noise outside my apartment. A faint ringing, rhythmic. I went to the window. No one was there, but the air smelled faintly metallic again, just like inside that chapel. I closed the blinds and tried to convince myself it was nothing. That night the ringing came again, closer this time, followed by a soft sound like water dripping. On impulse I went to the sink, thinking it was leaking, but it wasn't. The sound was coming from the living room, from my camera bag. My stomach turned cold. I pulled it out, unzipped it, and froze. The lens cap was off. The lens itself was fogged, smeared from the inside with something dark. I tilted it and a single drop slid down the glass, red and slow, leaving a streak that looked almost exactly like the one on the crucifix. I dropped it and it cracked on the floor. The sound stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. A week later, I got a message from a local reporter I'd met once while covering abandoned structures. She said she'd found my name on a forum where people were discussing the chapel again. She wanted to know if I had photos because there'd been a fire out there. Someone had tried to burn the place down 2 nights prior. The weird part was the fire department said the interior was untouched. Only the sand around the chapel had burned in a perfect circle. No one found signs of human presence. Just one thing out of place, the crucifix. It had been moved from the altar and was lying outside in the sand, perfectly upright. And the arms were now carved higher, palms facing outward, as if to block something. She said that when they found it, the wood was warm. That was 2 years ago. The chapel's road has since been fenced off by the county, but sometimes on Good Friday, people in the nearby town still claim to see red light flickering out there, as if candles are burning inside again. I've stopped taking photos of abandoned places, but last week when I was driving west at dusk, I saw something standing on the ridge just past the road's turnoff. A tall shape, wooden maybe, arms raised in the dying sun. For a moment I thought it was a cross, but when I slowed down I realized it wasn't still. It was facing me, and something dark was running down from its outstretched hands, glinting red in the last light before the desert swallowed it whole. In the heart of Abilene, where the streets stretch wide and the wind carries dust like whispers, there stands an old shell of brick and iron that the city has long tried to forget. Firehouse 47 was once the pride of the town. It stood 2 stories tall with a red-painted front and the kind of brass bell that could wake every soul within a mile when it rang. But for nearly 50 years, no one has stepped through its doors. The city fenced it off, claimed it was unsafe, but the truth is nobody wanted to be near it. Not after what happened on a stormy night in 1973, when the entire crew perished in a fire that shouldn't have been able to burn as hot as it did. The story starts years later when I moved to Abilene for work. I rented a small apartment on South 11th, 2 blocks away from the old firehouse. My bedroom window faced it, and from where I lay, I could see its silhouette at night. Roof sagging, windows black like hollow eyes. On my second night there, around midnight, I heard it, a distant clang that echoed through the stillness. It took me a moment to realize it was a bell. Not a church bell, not a wind chime, but that heavy, resonant sound of metal striking metal. It rang 3 times, clear and deliberate, before the silence returned. I asked my landlord about it the next day. He was an old man, the kind who'd seen the town's better days. When I mentioned the bell, he went quiet for a long moment, then said, "That bell shouldn't be ringing, son. They took the clapper out after the fire. Or at least they said they did." He told me how the fire started in the middle of the night, how the crew inside never made it out. The building burned from the inside out, the blaze so intense it melted the trucks parked inside. When they found the men, the report said the blaze was caused by faulty wiring. But people in town still whispered about something else, something that called to them that night, something that made them open those heavy doors even as the flames poured through. Over the next few weeks, the bell became part of my nights. Always at midnight, always 3 rings. It wasn't loud enough to wake the neighborhood, but I heard it every single time. I thought about recording it, but each night when the moment came, I'd freeze. It wasn't fear at first, just unease. Then one night I saw the light, a flicker from one of the broken second-floor windows. I watched it shimmer, pale orange, like firelight reflected off glass. Then another light, then a third. It was faint, but it moved, just like someone walking with a lantern inside. I stayed at the window for what felt like hours, but it never came out. The next morning I went closer. The air around the building was colder somehow and smelled faintly of wet ash, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. There was a small memorial plaque near the door, 7 names carved into bronze. Each one had the same date of death, July 12, 1973. Someone had left fresh flowers there. I bent to read the names when I noticed the faintest sound from inside. It wasn't the bell this time. It was a cough, faint, hoarse, like someone clearing smoke from their throat. I told myself it was wind echoing through the vents, but when I stepped back, I could see a smudge on the glass door. A handprint, long fingers blackened with soot. I tried to ignore it, but it kept happening. The lights, the smell, the sound of boots scuffing on concrete. Then one night I woke to the sound of engines. Not modern ones, these were old, deep mechanical roars, like the kind you'd hear from a vintage truck. The noise came from the direction of the firehouse, and with it came the faint blare of a siren, one that started low and grew until I swore it was passing right by my window. I jumped up, heart pounding, and pulled aside the curtain just in time to see a beam of red light streak past my apartment and fade into the dark. The streets were empty, completely silent again. I told myself I was imagining it all. Sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion. But curiosity got the better of me. The next night I went out there myself. Midnight. The moon was bright, the wind soft. I stood at the front of the firehouse and waited. At exactly 12 the bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then from somewhere deep inside came the sound of heavy boots running, men shouting orders, the unmistakable clatter of hoses being dragged. I could even hear laughter, quick, urgent, like a team preparing to head out. I should have run, but I stepped forward instead, peering through the gap in the door where the wood had rotted away. I saw the faint orange glow again. It was moving now, darting between the shadows, followed by figures, 7 of them. They wore old-style turnout coats, their helmets reflecting the dim light. Their faces were pale and hollow, mouths open but voiceless as they rushed toward the back wall. Then they were gone. I don't remember running home, but I woke up in my bed, shoes still on, window wide open. My throat ached like I'd been breathing smoke. My hands smelled like ash. I packed to leave that day, but something made me go back once more before I left town. Maybe I needed proof. Maybe I just couldn't leave it alone. When I arrived, the city had finally started sealing it off with boards and metal fencing. I asked one of the workers what they planned to do with it. He shrugged and said it was being demolished soon. Too unstable, he said. I asked if they'd found anything inside. He looked at me strangely and said they'd found old helmets, melted tools, and a bell rope that looked like someone had been pulling it from inside. Funny thing, he said. There were fresh footprints in the dust. 7 sets, all leading out the back. But the rear door hasn't opened in decades. That night I slept at a motel outside town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really done with that place. Around midnight I woke up to the faint sound of sirens again. Distant but familiar. I went to the window, and there, far on the horizon, I saw a flicker of red light. For a moment I thought it was an emergency somewhere nearby until I realized the light wasn't moving. It was pulsing, like a heartbeat right where the firehouse should have been. Then came the bell. 3 clear rings echoing across the plains. I left Abilene the next morning. Years later, I read online that the old firehouse was finally torn down, but the workers refused to stay after dark. Some claimed they heard voices in the rubble, calling out for help. One said he saw someone in an old fireman's coat standing on the roof that wasn't there anymore, staring toward the city. The demolition took longer than expected, and every night the equipment was found moved or damaged, like someone was trying to stop them. When the job was finally done, they paved over the lot. It's a parking area now, just a flat stretch of asphalt, but locals still say that if you drive past around midnight, you can hear that bell ringing faintly under the wind. Some swear they see the red flash of an engine turning onto the street, only to vanish before the sound fades. They call it the Phantom Firehouse of Abilene. As for me, I never went back. But sometimes when I can't sleep, I'll hear a faint clang in the distance. Always 3 times. Always around midnight. And every time it happens, I can almost smell the smoke again. In the center of Huntsville, where the streets still hold the ghostly rhythm of the past, stands a gnarled oak so massive it seems to grow straight out of history itself. The locals call it the Weeping Oak. Its roots split the ground like veins, its branches heavy and wide, and when the wind passes through them, they sound almost like a woman crying. I moved to Huntsville 3 years ago to teach history at the community college. I'd always loved old towns, and Huntsville, with its antebellum courthouse, the crumbling jail museum, and the whispers of Sam Houston, seemed perfect. But my rental house was 2 blocks from the courthouse square, right near that oak, and it didn't take long before I understood why the locals crossed the street to avoid it after dark. The first night I walked past it, it was just after 10. I'd been grading papers at the cafe, and the street was empty except for a single streetlight flickering near the courthouse steps. The oak stood under it, its leaves shifting in the cold wind. I remember stopping because I thought I heard something, soft, like someone sobbing quietly. It came from the base of the tree. I told myself it was just the wind. I even walked closer, laughing nervously at how jumpy I was being. But the closer I got, the colder the air became until my breath came out in pale, thin clouds. And then I saw it, something glistening on the bark like streaks of water. Tears. The oak looked like it was crying. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked one of my older students, a woman named Helen, if she knew anything about the oak. She gave me this look that told me I shouldn't have asked. She said the story went back to 1893, when a man named Jeremiah Pike was hanged there for murdering his wife. Public hangings were still legal back then, and they say the whole town came out to watch. But there was a woman who refused to leave his side until the end, his lover, Clara Holt. Some claimed she was the one who betrayed him, others that she was innocent and loved him too much to leave. When they put the rope around his neck, she screamed so hard her voice gave out. The next morning, she was found dead at the base of the oak, her arms around the roots, her dress soaked as if she'd been crying for hours. People said her ghost never left. Every night since, when the courthouse clock strikes midnight, you can hear her weeping under the tree, still mourning the man who swung from its branches. I didn't believe it, not really. I've studied folklore my whole life. These stories are built to scare, to give small towns their shadows. But something about that night haunted me. I started walking by the oak again, almost every evening, sometimes sitting on the courthouse steps just to listen. And then one night I heard it again. The same quiet sobbing. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, human, and so heartbreakingly sad that I felt my throat tighten. I turned on my phone flashlight and shone it toward the base of the oak. For a split second, I thought I saw a woman kneeling there, long hair falling over her shoulders, her dress pale as moonlight. When the light hit her, she vanished. The sobbing stopped. My phone battery drained instantly, the screen going black. I went home shaken, and for the first time in years, I locked every door in the house. The next morning, I told myself it was exhaustion. Maybe a trick of the light, but strange things started happening after that. My house smelled faintly of wet earth every night, like rain-soaked bark. The wooden floor near my front door was damp when I woke up, though it hadn't rained in days. And once, when I looked out my window at midnight, I saw a shadow standing beneath the oak, a woman's shape just staring up at it. The wind was still, but the branches swayed above her, creaking as if reacting to her presence. A week later, I visited the local archives. The librarian, an old man named Reese, helped me find the 1893 records. The hanging was real. Jeremiah Pike was executed for killing his wife, Lillian Pike, with a hammer, but there was a detail I hadn't heard before. Lillian's body was never found. Pike claimed he buried her where the oak drinks. He never explained what that meant. I asked about Clara Holt. She wasn't listed as his lover. In fact, there was no record of her death at all. Reese frowned, saying maybe she wasn't real. Maybe someone added her to make the story tragic. But I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe that either. Before I left, he said something I can't forget. That tree's roots go deeper than any grave in town. That night, I went back to the oak. I don't know what I expected. The square was deserted, the air heavy and still. I brought my phone again, hit record, and set it on the sidewalk as I stood near the base of the tree. Midnight came. The courthouse bell rang 12 times. On the 12th, the air turned cold enough to hurt. And then I heard it, soft crying like someone right beside me. My heart hammered as I whispered, "Clara?" The sobbing paused. Then a woman's voice answered, quiet and trembling, "He's still here." I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. For a moment, I saw her clearly. A young woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face streaked with tears that weren't falling but seeping from her skin like water through bark. Her eyes were dark, her lips pale, and she looked terrified, not of me, but of something behind me. The rope hanging from one of the branches swayed gently, though the air was still. I felt movement behind me, a shift of shadow like someone stepping out from the darkness of the tree. Clara's eyes widened. "Don't let him see you," she whispered. The rope snapped tight, and I heard the creak of it under sudden weight. I looked up and saw what I can only describe as a shape, barely human, hanging just above me. A man's outline swaying, head tilted, boots turning slowly in the night air. His face was hidden in darkness, but I could hear the sound of his breath, slow and heavy. And then a voice, low, raspy, barely a whisper, said, "You shouldn't have dug her up." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my house, and even then I didn't look back. When I checked my phone later, the recording was corrupted. It was all static except for one faint part. Right at the end, me breathing hard and a woman's voice whispering, "He's still hanging." 2 nights later, city workers began excavating near the courthouse for new wiring. They hit something large under the oak, an old wooden box wrapped in rusted chains. Inside were bones. A wedding ring was still on one hand. The name engraved inside it read LP. They closed the site within hours. The workers refused to go back. The next day, the local paper said the remains were sent for examination, but no report ever followed. The oak was fenced off after that, and a no trespassing sign went up. But the crying never stopped. I moved away a few months later. Huntsville was beautiful, but every night when the wind came through the trees, I'd hear it. The faint, distant sound of someone weeping. Last week, a friend sent me a photo from town. The oak's branches were bare now, the fence rusted. And under it, in the dirt, something new had appeared. A second rope, coiled and waiting, hanging just low enough for someone my height. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I pulled into that rest stop off Highway 281, somewhere between Lampasas and the Brazos River. I'd been driving since San Antonio, hauling a load of industrial filters up toward Wichita Falls. The air outside had that heavy, late summer thickness, and even with the AC running, the cab smelled faintly of diesel and sweat. I wasn't supposed to stop, but my eyelids were drooping, and I figured 10 minutes wouldn't kill me. The place looked ordinary enough. 2 vending machines glowing under the shelter, a couple of dim streetlights buzzing, and the hum of cicadas so loud it seemed to fill the whole lot. But the first thing I noticed was the lack of any other vehicles. That stretch of 281 usually had at least 1 or 2 truckers parked in the corners, but I was completely alone. Not even a stray sedan or a passing car. I cut the engine, stepped out, and stretched. Gravel crunched under my boots. The silence hit me then, deep and uncomfortable, like someone had turned the world down a notch. The cicadas stopped all at once. It was eerie, but I brushed it off, walked toward the restroom building, and splashed some water on my face. When I came back out, she was standing near my truck. At first, I thought she was some drunk woman who'd wandered off the highway. She had long black hair that looked soaked, like she'd been caught in a storm. Her white dress was torn down one side, and though the light was poor, I could see it was a wedding dress. She was barefoot. Her skin was pale. Not the kind of pale you see in bad lighting, but cold, washed out like candle wax. She didn't move when I approached, just stood there near the passenger side of my rig. I called out, asking if she was okay. No answer. Her eyes were dark, wide, and fixed on me like she was trying to remember who I was. Something about the way she looked made the hair on my arms stand up. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I asked again, stepping closer. That's when she spoke, barely above a whisper. "Can you take me across the bridge?" Her voice sounded tired, like she'd been crying for hours. I nodded before I even thought about it. It was late, I was alone, and leaving her there didn't sit right with me. I opened the passenger door and helped her in. Her skin was cold to the touch, colder than the night air. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead. Every few seconds, I'd glance at her. Her dress was filthy and ripped, and the lace near her wrist was frayed. I tried to keep my eyes on the road. "What's your name?" I finally asked. "Claire," she said after a long pause. "All right, Claire," I said softly. "Where's your car? Or your folks?" "They're gone," she murmured. The way she said it sent a chill through me. Gone, not missing. Not left behind, just gone. We drove for another 5 minutes, and then she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Do you know where the Brazos Bridge is?" I nodded. "It's about 10 miles north." "Good," she said. "That's where I need to go." Something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd said that line before. I asked her if she lived nearby, but she didn't answer. The silence stretched until the only sounds were the hum of my tires and the low whistle of wind through the vents. As we got closer to the bridge, fog began to roll across the highway. It wasn't normal fog. It came in thick waves, heavy and low, like smoke. My headlights cut through it only a few feet ahead. I slowed down, uneasy. "Almost there," she said suddenly. I turned toward her, but she was staring straight ahead. Her fingers gripped the edge of the seat tightly. Then, just as the bridge came into view, my truck's radio came to life. It wasn't music, just static, sharp and loud. The CB light flickered, and through the distortion I thought I heard something like a voice. A woman's voice, faint, crying. I reached to turn the knob, but it kept hissing. When I looked back toward the passenger seat, she was gone. I slammed the brakes hard. The seat was empty. The door was still locked. The seatbelt hung loose, swaying slightly as if someone had just unbuckled it. My chest felt tight and my hands were shaking. I pulled the rig to the shoulder, jumped out, and shined my flashlight toward the bridge. Nothing. Just the thick fog and the river below. The air smelled like wet earth and old metal. I stood there for a while, listening. I thought I heard something, a sob maybe, but it could have been the water. After a few minutes, I climbed back into the cab and drove across the bridge as slowly as I could. When I reached the other side, I realized the passenger seat was damp, like someone had been sitting there with a soaked dress. By the time I made it to the next truck stop, I was pale and trembling. The guy behind the counter saw me and asked if I was okay. I told him what happened. He stared at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. "You picked her up, didn't you?" he said. I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The bride," he said quietly. "She's been out there for years. Died in a wreck back in the 70s. Wedding night. Car went off the Brazos Bridge. They say she still tries to hitch a ride across." I told him that was ridiculous, that I must have imagined it, but he just looked at me like he'd heard it all before. I left soon after. Couldn't shake the cold that settled in my chest. For weeks I tried convincing myself it was exhaustion or some kind of trick of the fog. But then, about a month later, I was parked at another rest stop outside Johnson City when a young trucker struck up a conversation. He said he'd seen something strange near the Brazos. A woman in white waving him down. He didn't stop. When I asked what made him sure it was a woman, he said her veil was blowing in the wind. I told him he did the right thing. Every time I drive that stretch now, I can't help glancing at the side mirror as I pass the bridge. Sometimes I swear I see movement, something white near the guardrail. I don't stop anymore. Not for anyone. Because sometimes when the fog gets thick enough, I can still hear her voice over the radio. Soft, distant, and sad. Asking for a ride. Under the cold, endless sky of Terrell County, where the desert stretches farther than most people's patience, there's a patch of land the locals call God's Hollow. It sits 15 miles past the old highway, where the pavement crumbles into gravel, and the power lines vanish into nothing but scrub brush and silence. There's no reason to go there, no towns, no stores, no living thing except the mesquite trees twisting out of the dirt. Yet people swear that on moonless nights a church rises out of that emptiness. No one built it. No one remembers it standing there. But when the sun comes up, all that's left is a perfect rectangle of ash, soft as snow, right where the front doors would have been. I didn't believe it at first. I was working out of Fort Stockton at the time, doing survey work for the county, mapping old parcels that hadn't been touched since the 1950s. My partner, Alonzo, was from Sanderson, and he wouldn't go near God's Hollow. He said his uncle once saw the church appear out of thin air, said he heard hymns in a language he didn't understand. The next morning, when he went back to the site, all that was left were black feathers and something that looked like melted glass embedded in the dirt. Alonzo never joked about that place. He made the sign of the cross every time we drove near it. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories, especially the kind that get passed around out here. Everyone wants to make the desert feel haunted. It's easier than admitting how lonely it really is. But the first time I saw the glow myself, I stopped laughing. It was late September, a night with no moon and not even the hum of crickets. I'd stayed too long at the office, driving home with the radio off because there was no signal. The highway was empty. Just me, my truck, and the reflection of my own headlights in the rearview mirror. I don't know why I decided to pull off. Maybe curiosity. Maybe boredom. The road curved past the broken fence that marked the county line, and beyond it, the flat land seemed darker than usual, like the earth itself was swallowing the starlight. Then I saw it. A faint orange glow flickering in the distance like the reflection of a bonfire. I killed the engine and sat there for a while watching it. It wasn't the shape of a campfire. It was too steady, too symmetrical. I thought maybe it was someone's property light, though there were no houses within 10 miles. Eventually, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The air felt wrong as soon as I crossed the fence. Colder somehow and thick with that dusty smell that comes before rain. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and I could see faint tracks, barefoot, too small to belong to an adult. The glow got brighter as I walked until I saw the outline of the church rising out of the dark. It wasn't made of stone or wood. It looked like shadow given form, tall spires blacker than the night behind it, and windows that pulsed faintly as if something inside was burning low. There was no sound. Not wind, not insects, not even the crunch of my boots. I should have turned around then, but curiosity's a cruel thing. The closer I got, the more the light shifted, becoming almost golden, and I could see what looked like figures moving inside. They were sitting in pews, heads bowed, hands clasped together like they were praying. I couldn't see their faces, just the outlines glowing faintly from within. A voice drifted out from the open doorway, deep and calm, reciting something that sounded like scripture but wasn't in any language I knew. When I reached the steps, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The ground beneath the church wasn't dirt. It was blackened, like it had been burned over and over again, and the steps themselves, though solid under my feet, left no shadow in the beam of my flashlight. Inside, the air shimmered like heat waves off asphalt. The pews were full, every figure motionless except for one near the front that slowly turned its head. The face was featureless, smooth and pale like the inside of a seashell. But when it looked at me, I heard something, not through my ears, but inside my chest. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the memory of one. It said, "You are late." I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, and that's when I saw it wasn't wood. It was ash, packed tight but still shifting with every step I took. A faint sound rose from beneath it, like whispering voices too deep to make sense of. I turned to run, but the doorway was gone. In its place stood a blank wall, rippling slightly as if it were breathing. The congregation began to move then all at once. They didn't stand. They unfolded. Their limbs bent wrong, long and thin, stretching toward me in silence. The figure at the pulpit raised its hand and the whispering stopped. Then just as suddenly the air changed again, a rush of heat, a sound like wind through a canyon, and I was outside on my knees in the dirt, staring at an empty field. The church was gone. Only the faint smell of smoke lingered, and when I touched the ground where the door had been, my fingers came away gray. When I finally made it back to the truck, dawn was breaking. The glow on the horizon was the first real light I'd seen in hours. My clothes were damp and my boots left black footprints on the floor mat. I didn't go back to work that day. I didn't tell Alonzo. I didn't tell anyone. But I couldn't stop thinking about what the voice had said. "You are late." Late for what? A week later, I drove back just to prove to myself it wasn't real. I told myself I'd find nothing but desert, and for the most part, that's what I did. Except for one thing. Right where the church had stood, there was a rectangular patch of ash. I knelt beside it, brushing the surface with my hand, and felt something hard beneath. When I dug it up, it was a small brass bell, melted and warped out of shape. When I turned it over, I saw words etched faintly along the edge. They weren't in English, but when I looked at them too long, my head started to ache. I buried it again and left. 2 months after that, a deputy went missing. He'd been responding to reports of trespassers out near God's Hollow. They found his cruiser the next morning, parked at the side of the road with the engine running and the radio hissing static. His footprints led off into the brush and stopped in the middle of a circle of gray ash. There was no sign of him after that. Now every time a moonless night rolls across Terrell County, I find myself listening. Sometimes I swear I can hear faint singing carried on the wind, low, mournful, and steady. And every time I wonder if the church is calling me back, because the voice wasn't angry when it said I was late. It was patient, certain, like it knew I'd come back eventually. And maybe when I do, the doors won't close behind me this time. Maybe I'll finally understand what they're praying for in that place that doesn't belong to God, or to anyone living. In Lockhart, the old sheriff's office sits on the corner of Market and Main like a relic that refuses to die. The county moved operations to a newer building decades ago, but the original structure remains in a square, 2-story brick box with barred windows and a crumbling sign that still reads, Caldwell County Sheriff's Department. Locals treat it like a piece of history, something you can take a picture of during a weekend visit. But the town's older residents don't linger there, especially after sunset. They say if you walk close enough on a quiet night, you'll hear a man's voice barking orders from inside the empty holding cell. The voice of Sheriff Samuel D. Harper, who died in 1947 during what was officially called an accidental shooting. I never believed any of that until last summer, when I took a job cataloging historical sites for a regional preservation project. My assignment was to photograph and document the interior of old municipal buildings across central Texas, including the abandoned sheriff's office in Lockhart. The building was locked when I arrived, but I had a key from the county records office. I remember standing there on that hot July afternoon, the air thick with humidity and the scent of oil and rust. The doorknob was warm to the touch. When I turned it, the hinges groaned like something alive. Inside, the air was still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy as if time itself has stopped moving. The front desk was covered in a thin film of dust, and old typewriter keys were scattered across the floor like teeth. A few faded wanted posters still hung on the wall, curling at the corners. One of them had a signature at the bottom, S.D. Harper. I set my camera up on a tripod and started photographing the booking area, the cells, and the small evidence room. Everything about the place felt wrong. The light filtering through the barred windows didn't seem to reach all the way to the corners, and even the sound of my footsteps seemed swallowed up by the walls. The temperature dropped noticeably when I moved into the holding cell area. It wasn't an air-conditioned kind of cool. It felt damp and raw like the inside of a cave. There were 3 cells, each no bigger than a pantry. The first 2 were empty except for a few rusted bed frames, but the third one still had a metal cot bolted to the wall. Its mattress had rotted away and something dark stained the floor beneath it. I raised my camera, adjusted the focus, and snapped a photo. Then I heard it. A deep, gravelly voice, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere behind me. "Lock that door, deputy," it said. I froze. The voice was so clear I could almost feel the breath behind it. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. My first thought was that someone was outside, maybe calling from the street. But when I stepped out into the booking area, I realized the windows were all sealed shut and the door was still locked from the inside. I told myself it was an echo, maybe some sound carrying through the vents. I tried to shake it off and went back to photographing the evidence room. That's when the voice came again, louder this time. "You hear me, boy?"
"Lock that damn door."
I dropped my camera. The sound was coming directly from the holding cell area. My pulse spiked as I crept back down the narrow hallway, my flashlight beam jittering against the walls. The voice had gone silent, but I could hear the faint sound of something metallic clinking, like a chain dragging slowly across concrete. When I reached the third cell, I stopped. The door, which had been rusted shut moments earlier, was now slightly open. Just a few inches, enough for a draft to slip through. I felt it brush my arm, cold and unnatural. I didn't touch the door, but I crouched down and peered inside. The cot was still there, the same stain darkening the floor, but now something else caught my eye. A pair of worn leather boots half hidden in the shadows. For a second, I thought someone was standing there, but when I swung the flashlight directly onto the spot, the boots were empty. I backed away slowly and nearly tripped over the camera strap lying on the floor. I grabbed my things and headed for the door, but before I could reach it, that same voice thundered again. Nobody leaves till I say so. It was right behind me this time. I spun around and saw a shape in the gloom, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a hat. It stood at the far end of the hallway, half shrouded in the murk, the faint glint of a badge catching my light. My throat went dry. "Sheriff Harper," I said before I could stop myself. The figure didn't move for a long moment. Then it stepped forward, and as it did, I saw that there was no face and just darkness where a face should be. The badge on its chest gleamed like fresh silver, and I could make out the faint outlines of a revolver at its hip. It raised one hand and pointed at me. "Who authorized you to enter this facility?" The voice rattled through the walls like a low growl. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs refused to obey. Every part of my body felt like it was trapped in syrup. The figure took another step forward, and I could hear the crunch of old debris under its boots. Then the cell doors behind me slammed shut, one after another, the sound echoing like gunshots. I must have blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember, I was sitting outside on the steps, my back pressed against the brick, the key still in my hand. The sun was lower in the sky, and my watch said nearly 2 hours had passed. My camera bag was beside me untouched, but when I looked inside, every photo I'd taken was gone. The memory card was blank, completely wiped. I drove back to my motel that evening and didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first, but I kept thinking about the sheriff's words, that hard edge of authority in his tone, the sound of someone used to being obeyed. I couldn't get it out of my head. Later that week, I visited the Lockhart Public Library to dig into the archives. Sheriff Samuel D. Harper had been in office from 1929 until his death in 1947. According to the records, he'd been shot during an attempted jailbreak, though some accounts suggested he might have been killed by one of his own deputies after years of reported abuse of power. Witnesses described him as a harsh man, prone to shouting orders even when no one disobeyed him. One inmate had written in a smuggled letter that the sheriff's voice never stops even after lights out. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove back to the old office. I told myself I needed closure, maybe to convince myself that what I'd seen was just exhaustion or bad lighting. But when I arrived, the building was different. The front door, which I'd locked behind me, was wide open. Inside, everything had been disturbed, papers scattered, furniture overturned. And in the dust near the cell block, there were footprints, heavy square-toed boots, the same kind the sheriff wore in the old photographs. I called out, half expecting to hear my own voice bounce back. But what answered was that same low growl I'd heard before, only softer this time, like a man speaking through clenched teeth. "You came back." My flashlight flickered once and went dark. The sound of metal scraping started again, slow and deliberate. I didn't wait this time. I turned and ran, the soles of my boots slapping the concrete. The door slammed shut behind me just as I cleared the threshold, the sound reverberating across the empty street. When I got home, I tried to forget it. Weeks passed. Then one evening, while reviewing photos from another assignment, I noticed a folder I didn't recognize. It was named Lockhart. I hadn't created it. Inside were 12 photographs, all black and white. The first few showed the booking area, the cells, and the desk. But the last one made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me standing in the holding cell, taken from behind the bars. My posture was stiff, as if I hadn't known someone was there. Behind me, faint but unmistakable, was the silhouette of a man in uniform, one hand raised, pointing directly at the camera. I deleted the folder instantly, but even now, when I turn off the lights, I can still hear that voice in my head. Short, sharp, commanding. "Lock that door, deputy." And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I swear I hear the faint click of a revolver being cocked, followed by a single, steady breath, waiting for me to answer. Under the pale wash of a November moon, the old wooden bridge outside Blanco looked like something half alive. its slats moaning whenever the wind passed through the ravine below. Locals called it Dead Man's Crossing, and the name had stuck long before anyone alive could remember why. Some said a horse thief was hanged from its beams after a gunfight with the sheriff back in the 1800s. Others swore it was a stagecoach driver who drowned when the Blanco River flooded one night, the bridge collapsing under his team. Either way, no one lingered there after sunset. It wasn't just the way the fog crawled up from the water, or how the planks creaked like bones. It was what people heard, the sound of boots pacing back and forth across the bridge when there was no one there. And sometimes, faint in the mist, a lantern swinging from nowhere at all. When I first heard about the place, I thought it was nothing more than a ghost story, one of those Texas legends told to keep kids from sneaking out at night. I was 24 then, working for a small paper out of San Marcos, and I wanted something with a little grit for my first feature. My editor, June, had mentioned Dead Man's Crossing offhand, saying it was a local curiosity that might make a good Halloween article. She said it with that half-smirk reporters get when they think they're feeding you a joke. But I took it seriously. I'd grown up around Blanco County, and I knew how these rural legends sometimes led to strange truths. Old crimes, forgotten tragedies, sometimes even bodies found where no one had thought to look. So one evening, with my notebook, camera, and a cup of gas station coffee, I drove down Farm Road 1623 and parked by the bridge just as the sun disappeared behind the oaks. The air smelled like cedar and wet dirt. The fog was already pooling around the low banks, so thick I could barely see 10 feet past the headlights. The bridge itself looked ancient, its boards gray and splintered, bolted together with rusting iron. Chains hung from one of the posts, maybe from an old floodgate, but they rattled gently like something moving them. I took a few pictures, testing the flash. Each time the light went off, the fog swallowed everything again, leaving me blind. That alone should have been enough to make me uneasy, but I was determined to see what everyone claimed they saw: the swaying lanterns. I waited an hour, leaning on the hood of my car, listening to the water below. There wasn't another vehicle for miles. The town lights were long behind me, hidden behind the fog, and even the crickets had gone quiet. That kind of silence makes you start hearing things that aren't there, small rustles, faint whispers that could be the wind or something worse. I just decided to call it a night when I caught sight of a glow. Faint at first, orange and distant, like a cigarette ember moving in slow arcs through the mist. I raised my camera, zoomed in, and froze. It was a lantern, no question. A round oil lantern swaying gently from side to side about halfway across the bridge. There was no one holding it. My pulse kicked hard against my ribs. I kept snapping pictures, the flash cutting through the dark, but every time the light went off, the lantern seemed closer. The third time I looked up, it had stopped moving. I thought I saw the faint shape of a man standing beside it. Tall, shoulders hunched forward, a hat pulled low. Then the fog thickened, swallowing him whole. The air grew colder all at once. A wet chill that went through my jacket like I'd stepped into a freezer. Somewhere on the bridge, wood creaked under a heavy weight. Footsteps. Slow, steady, coming toward me. I didn't think. I just called out, asking who was there. The footsteps stopped, then started again, faster this time, boards groaning with each step. I shined my flashlight down the bridge, but there was nothing. Only fog, thick and shapeless. Then the lantern's glow flickered once and went out. I stood frozen, heart hammering, the sound of boots echoing louder now, close enough that I swore I could feel the bridge trembling. I stumbled backward to my car, slamming the door and locking it. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the bridge, and for a few seconds there was only the hum of my engine. Then faintly through the windshield I heard a low voice. It wasn't yelling or whispering, just a steady rhythm like someone giving orders. I couldn't make out the words, but there was authority in them, a rough command that made my stomach tighten. Then silence. Not even the sound of water. I left. I didn't even look back until I hit the highway. The photos I took didn't show much, just fog, blackness, and one strange blur that might have been the lantern. My editor brushed it off, said I'd scared myself, maybe caught headlights from a car downriver. I wanted to believe that, but a week later, I went back with a friend named Caleb. He didn't believe in ghosts and wanted to prove it. We brought a digital recorder this time, thinking maybe we could catch something. EVP or whatever they call it. When we got there, it was colder than before, a thin frost clinging to the rails. Caleb started walking across, stomping his boots like he wanted to wake the dead. I told him to be careful, that the boards might not hold, but he just laughed. Halfway across, he stopped. His flashlight beam bounced off the fog and caught something. Wet footprints on the planks ahead of him. Bare footprints leading toward the middle of the bridge and stopping at the same spot where I'd seen the lantern. Then, without warning, his light flickered out. I heard him curse, then the creak of wood shifting. He called my name, voice sharp. When I stepped onto the bridge to go to him, the fog swallowed everything. I could barely see his outline. The air smelled of old wood and something sour like burnt oil. Then came the footsteps again, but they weren't his. Heavy, dragging, slow.
Caleb yelled for me to shine my light, but the beam barely reached him.
When it did, I saw him backing away, eyes wide. He said someone was standing behind me. I turned, but there was only fog. Then something cold brushed my shoulder like the edge of a wet coat. A man's voice rasped, "Move along." We ran. The recorder fell somewhere on the board, still running. When we played it back later, the sound was faint but clear. Boots pacing, wood groaning, and that same deep voice saying, "Keep off my bridge." 2 nights later, Caleb called me after midnight. He sounded shaken, said he kept hearing boots outside his house on the gravel drive. When he looked, there was nothing. But the next morning he found muddy prints leading from his porch to his truck. The pattern matched the bridge. Bare feet, wet, narrow, with long toes that looked more like they belonged to something not quite human. He didn't go back there again. Neither did I for a long time. But stories have a way of finding you again. A few months later, the sheriff's office reached out. They were repairing the old bridge, trying to stabilize it before the spring floods, and the crew refused to keep working after dark. Tools went missing, machines turned on by themselves, and one worker swore he saw a lantern swinging from an invisible hand. They'd found an old chain buried under the mud near one of the posts. Attached to it was a shackle rusted through. When they pulled it free, the bridge made a sound like something exhaling. The foreman said it was just settling. The next day, the scaffolding collapsed into the river, killing one of the men instantly. That was 10 years ago. The bridge is still standing, though no one drives over it now. Locals built a new one a few hundred yards upstream, and Dead Man's Crossing was left to rot. But every so often, someone posts a photo online, fog rolling in thick as smoke and a faint orange glow hanging in the mist. They say if you stop there long enough, you'll hear footsteps on the wood and the voice of a man giving orders to no one. Some claim it's the spirit of the sheriff who hanged a murderer there long ago. Others say it's the murderer himself, doomed to walk that bridge until he finds a way off. I don't know which is worse. All I know is, when I drive through Blanco late at night and the fog settles over the road, I still see that faint flicker in the distance, swaying side to side, waiting for someone to stop. And every time, without fail, I press harder on the gas and don't look back. Late one night in early October, I was driving through a lonely stretch of Highway 31, just outside Corsicana. The air was heavy with that strange quiet you only get in Texas backroads where even the crickets sound distant. I'd been heading home from a construction job in Tyler, running later than I meant to. And when the fuel light blinked on, I realized I hadn't passed a gas station in nearly an hour. I wasn't panicking, but I knew I had to pull over soon. That's when I saw it, the sign flickering faintly through the dark mist, buzzing like a dying fly. Lone Star Motor Lodge, it said, the no vacancy part sputtering to life even though the place looked completely deserted. My first thought was that it must have shut down years ago. The sign was tilted, half swallowed by vines, and the gravel lot was cracked with weeds growing through. But as my engine coughed and sputtered, I didn't have much choice. I coasted into the lot and parked near the office, my headlight sweeping over a row of blackened door frames. The whole front of the building looked burned, scorched up to the second story like someone had tried to erase it with fire. When I stepped out, the night hit me differently. Still air, no crickets now. Not even the sound of my car's cooling engine seemed to settle right. The sign buzzed above, faintly lighting up the parking lot every few seconds in a weak yellow flash. I noticed melted plastic where the front office window used to be, and the faint smell of old smoke, like a campfire that had gone out long ago but left something behind. I tried to call my roadside service, but of course there was no signal. That's when I saw the door to the office hanging half open. Something inside was swaying in the light breeze, a set of keys on a pegboard glinting whenever the sign flickered. I called out, "Hello?" but my voice sounded small against the emptiness. There was no answer, just a soft creak somewhere deeper inside the dark office. I should have gone back to my car, I know that now. But exhaustion makes people do dumb things. I stepped through the door, crunching on broken glass. The inside smelled of mold and burnt carpet. There was an old counter with a bell on top, blackened and cracked from heat. Behind it was a wall of mail slots, each labeled with room numbers. Some still had keys hanging from them. I ran my hand across the countertop, leaving a trail in the soot. On the wall was an old calendar from 1997. The date circled in red read, May 6th inspection. I looked down and saw a framed certificate on the floor, its glass spider-webbed with cracks. Lone Star Motor Lodge, family-owned since 1959. I don't know why, but that phrase, family-owned, made me feel uneasy, like the word family didn't mean the same thing in a place like this. Then the bell on the counter rang by itself. I froze. It wasn't loud, just a soft metallic ding that echoed longer than it should have. I turned to leave, but the keys on the wall started to rattle, like something had brushed against them. I backed away and almost tripped over a scorched chair. That's when the overhead light blinked on, dim and sickly, even though I could see the wires dangling loose from the ceiling. For a moment, I thought I saw movement through the office doorway, a figure shifting past the cracked glass door leading to the rooms outside. My breath caught. When I blinked, it was gone. I decided I'd sleep in my truck until morning, but when I got back outside, I noticed something strange. One of the motel doors down the row was slightly open. Room 12. A dull amber glow came from inside, like a lamp covered with an old shade. Against all reason, I started walking toward it. My boots crunched the gravel, and with each step, the buzzing of the no vacancy sign seemed to get louder, almost angry. When I reached the door, I could smell that same burnt wood again. But underneath it was something else, something sweet, like candle wax and rot. I nudged the door open. Inside, the room looked untouched by time. The bedspread was still tucked neatly, though covered in a fine layer of ash. A television sat on a dresser, dead but reflecting the weak light from the lamp. On the table there was a phone, one of those rotary kinds, and next to it an old guest ledger. The pages were yellowed and stiff. I flipped through a few, noticing that every entry stopped on the same date, May 6, 1997. I ran my finger down the list of names. Howard family, room 3. Mitchell couple, room 7. C. Larrabee, room 12. My hand went cold when I saw that last one. It was written in a different ink, darker, fresher somehow. And underneath the name, in shaky letters, was a note, still here. The air in the room felt heavier. I looked up and saw a shape in the reflection of the TV. Someone was standing in the doorway behind me. I turned, but no one was there. The door was shut now, though I didn't remember closing it. The lamp flickered once and went out, plunging the room into a thick shadow. I could still make out the shape of the bed, the dresser, the phone. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing, slow, ragged, coming from under the bed. My heart hammered as I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right beneath my boots. I lunged for the door and yanked it open. The parking lot outside was pitch black now. No flickering sign, no light from the office. It was as if the motel had swallowed its own glow. I ran toward my truck, my feet slipping on the gravel, and when I got inside, I locked the doors and tried the ignition. Nothing, not even a click. The windshield fogged from the inside like something breathing against the glass. Then the no vacancy sign flared back to life, blazing red this time, humming so loudly I could feel it in my chest. Through the windshield, I saw figures stepping out from the rooms. Silhouettes of men, women, and children, all burned, their skin blackened and peeling. They moved slowly, almost calmly toward me. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the sign's red light. The first one reached my door and pressed its hand against the window. The glass hissed under the touch, a faint sizzling sound. I fumbled for the ignition again, whispering to myself, and then, as suddenly as it began, the light from the sign blinked out. Total darkness. The figures vanished. I don't remember what happened next exactly. I must have blacked out because when I opened my eyes again, the sun was rising. My truck was parked on the side of the highway, not in the motel lot. The sign, the building, everything when it was gone. Just an empty stretch of overgrown field, with a few blackened posts sticking out of the ground like grave markers. My engine started without hesitation. As if nothing had ever happened, I drove straight to a diner in Corsicana and told the man behind the counter what I'd seen. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "You stopped at the Lone Star, didn't you?" I asked him what he meant. He told me the motel had burned down in 1997. A family running it left a faulty heater on overnight. The fire spread fast. Everyone inside, owners, guests, even a traveling preacher, died before the fire trucks arrived. He said people sometimes see the lights come on there when storms roll through, or when someone's desperate enough to stop. The sign always says no vacancy. It's a warning, he told me. The dead don't like visitors. I never drove that way again, not even during the day. But sometimes when I pass through Corsicana at night, I swear I can see the faint flicker of that red neon glow far out in the dark fields, pulsing like a heartbeat, waiting for someone else to run out of gas. They say Lake Worth used to be smaller before the dam was built, back when it was just a shallow body of water surrounded by oak groves and farmland. In the 1920s, when Fort Worth was expanding, the city decided to flood the valley to create a proper reservoir. The official story says they relocated the small family cemetery that sat in the hollow before the water came. But the divers who've gone down there tell a different tale. They say the gravestones are still there, standing upright beneath the murk, covered in silt and algae, names still faintly visible when your light hits them just right. I never believed those stories until I saw what was down there myself. I was part of a local dive team that did maintenance checks for the city. Nothing fancy, mostly pipeline inspections and lost boat recoveries. The summer of 2016 was hot, and the drought had dropped the lake level by almost 10 feet. The city wanted us to check a few old intake structures near the western end, an area that hadn't been touched since the 70s. The water there was stagnant, dark like brewed coffee, and smelled faintly metallic. My partner that day was Jake Turner, a guy I'd known for years. He liked to joke too much on the surface, but once we were underwater, he was all focus. We both had that steady kind of temperament divers need, calm when things go wrong. At least, that's what I thought. The first dive was routine. Visibility was maybe 3 feet. The beam of my flashlight cut through what looked like floating dust, though it was probably decomposed vegetation and lake muck. We followed the old survey line toward the intake vent, keeping close to the bottom. I could hear the hum of my regulator, slow and steady like breathing through a long tunnel. About 15 minutes in, Jake signaled that something was ahead. He angled his light downward, and that's when I saw it. A slab of white stone rising out of the mud, tilted slightly like the corner of a table buried in sand. It didn't look like natural rock. I swam closer and brushed away the algae with my glove. What came into view made my chest tighten. It was marble, or what used to be. The engraving was worn, but I could still read the top line. "In memory of," before the rest was lost to erosion. Jake pointed further ahead. There were more of them, half-buried headstones in neat rows, maybe 10 or 15 that we could see before the darkness swallowed the rest. I felt a jolt of nausea, a kind of cold realization of what we'd stumbled into. It wasn't a legend. The cemetery hadn't been moved at all. It had been drowned. We surfaced after 20 minutes, neither of us talking as we pulled ourselves onto the boat. Jake finally broke the silence. "You saw them too, right?" I nodded. "We should tell someone," he said, though his tone sounded unsure, like he already knew how that conversation would go. The city wouldn't admit to leaving a graveyard underwater for nearly a century. Too much liability, too much scandal. We agreed to keep it quiet for now, to go back down the next morning and document it properly. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the faint outlines of names and dates on those stones, some going back to the 1880s. Families that had probably just been forgotten. The next morning, a thin fog rolled over the lake. It clung low to the water, giving everything a milky, dreamlike look. We prepped the gear in silence. Something about that place didn't feel right anymore. When we dropped in, visibility was even worse. The sunlight barely reached us. The deeper we went, the colder it got, unnaturally cold for that time of year. I checked my gauge, and we weren't even at 30 feet yet. That's when Jake's light flickered ahead of me. I thought it was his signal, but then it went out completely. I reached toward the glow of my own beam and found nothing but swirling blackness. My first thought was that his battery had died. I tried signaling by tapping my knife on my tank, a sharp metallic sound. Nothing. Then I caught movement in the silt below, a shape human-sized drifting slowly upward. I started forward thinking it was Jake rising uncontrolled, but the closer I got, the less it looked like a diver. The figure was pale, almost translucent in my light, arms loose and swaying like it was caught in a slow current. Its head tilted slightly, mouth open as if gasping for air. For a second I thought it might be a drowned body caught in the muck, one that had come loose, but then its eyes opened, or what looked like eyes, two black voids staring directly at me through the water. Every instinct screamed to ascend, but I couldn't move. It hovered there, inches from my faceplate, the edges of its body dissolving in the murk like smoke underwater. My regulator hissed too fast, my breath shallow. Then it turned its head slowly toward the left, as if pointing. My light followed, and I saw the faint glow of something on the lake bed. It wasn't bioluminescence, not in fresh water. It was a line of blue light tracing through the mud, words carved into stone and shining faintly. Before I could read them, Jake's hand grabbed my shoulder from behind. I jerked so hard I almost lost my mouthpiece. His light was back on, his eyes wide inside his mask. He motioned frantically to surface. When we broke the water, Jake ripped off his mask and gasped. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I didn't answer. We both sat there shaking, staring at the calm surface as if expecting it to boil. He said he'd lost sight of me after a few minutes, that his light started dying for no reason. Then something had pulled on his fin, a steady downward tug like someone grabbing him from the bottom. He'd kicked free and come up. We didn't speak of it again until later that night, after we'd filed a generic report about equipment malfunction. Jake started drinking heavier after that. He quit the dive team a month later, said he was done with lakes altogether. I tried to move on, but something about Lake Worth stayed in my head. That fall, fishermen started reporting strange lights under the water at night, a faint blue shimmer that moved slowly, almost like lanterns drifting beneath the surface. The city blamed it on chemical runoff or reflection from dock lights, but locals knew better. They said it was the dead remembering where they were buried. I thought it was nonsense until one night when I drove out there myself. I parked near the old recreation pier, the one half collapsed into the lake, and waited. The air was thick and still, crickets muted, no wind at all. Around midnight, the water began to glow. Not bright, just a subtle pulse of blue and green light moving in ripples. It gathered near the center of the lake, right where we'd found the gravestones. I could see shapes in it, outlines that looked almost human, rising and fading beneath the surface. Then faintly I heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the water. It was the echo of voices, distant, layered, whispering things I couldn't make out, the kind of voices that come from deep below, not from the air around you. The next morning, the news reported a boating accident on the same stretch of water. A man had gone overboard during the night and never resurfaced. They found his boat circling slowly, engine still running, deck light glowing over an empty seat. The recovery divers refused to talk about what they saw down there, but one of them, a guy I knew from a nearby station, called me a few days later. His voice was flat. He said they'd found the body wedged between two old headstones, his arm twisted like he'd been reaching for something carved into one of them. They'd tried to pull him free, but his hand wouldn't let go until they cut his glove off. When they brought him up, his wrist was blue and swollen, marked with what looked like small handprints, child-sized. After that, I stopped going near Lake Worth. Jake moved out of state, though I still get Christmas cards from him sometimes, usually with a little joke about staying above water. But I drive past the lake occasionally when I'm headed toward Jacksboro, and if it's late and the moon's out, I can still see that faint shimmer over the surface. It's not the reflection of the stars or the city lights. It's deeper than that, coming from beneath, like the earth itself remembers what we buried under all that water. Some nights when the wind dies and the lake goes still, you can even see the tops of the stones through the shallows near the dam, gray edges just visible before vanishing again into the dark. People say the water level keeps dropping a little more every year. If that's true, maybe someday those graves will rise again. Maybe that's what the light's been trying to warn us about all along. In Austin, the old state hospital sits behind high chain-link fencing, its crumbling wings half swallowed by vines and mesquite. Everyone in town knows the stories about it. Some say you can still hear the patients crying when the wind shifts over the grounds at night. Others talk about shadows moving in the broken windows, But the one that keeps most people away is what happens inside the main building, what the locals call the Hall of Whispers. I never believed any of it until I went there myself, and I still wish I hadn't. I was a photography student at the University of Texas, working on a project about forgotten architecture. Abandoned places fascinated me, the way they held onto pieces of human life like fingerprints and dust. The Austin State Hospital had been on my list for months, but getting inside wasn't easy. Security had tightened after some kids vandalized one of the wards. But a friend of mine, Mason, had gone a few weeks before and told me about a side door that was never properly sealed. We went one cloudy afternoon in late November, just before dusk. The air was damp and cold, and the trees around the property leaned like old men. Mason led the way through a hole in the fence near the east wing, and we slipped into the building. Inside, it smelled of mildew and something metallic that reminded me of blood. The hallways stretched long and narrow, with cracked tile floors and peeling green paint that flaked like old skin. Every few feet, our footsteps sent echoes rolling down corridors that ended in darkness. There were still gurneys in some rooms, overturned chairs, even papers scattered like the doctors just vanished mid-shift. I took photos while Mason wandered ahead with a flashlight. When I snapped a picture down one hallway, the flash lit up a mural painted on the wall, a tree with human faces hidden in its branches. Someone had scrawled words beneath it, "Listen closely." I asked Mason if he saw it when he came before, but he didn't answer. His light had disappeared around the corner. I called his name again, and that's when I heard it, the first whisper. It came so faintly I thought it was the wind pushing through broken windows. But it wasn't the wind. It was my name, soft and drawn out. "Nathan." I froze. Mason liked to mess with me, so I figured he was hiding, trying to freak me out. I laughed and told him to cut it out, but the sound didn't stop. It repeated slower this time, and I realized it wasn't saying my name, it was saying something that sounded like it but reversed, the syllables twisted backward. It made my stomach turn cold. I turned toward the sound, and for a moment I thought I saw someone standing at the far end of the hall. The light through the windows was dim, just enough to outline a shape. Tall, still, head tilted slightly. But when I blinked, it was gone. Mason came back a minute later from a side corridor, confused about why I was pale and shaking. I told him what I heard, but he just smirked and said I'd let the place get in my head. We went deeper anyway. I should have left then. The hospital had several wards that connected through underground tunnels, but the main building had a long corridor with high ceilings and wide arches that people online had nicknamed the Hall of Whispers. Supposedly, if you stood in the middle of it and said your name, you'd hear it repeated backward from the dark. Mason wanted to test it. I didn't. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was thicker, like breathing through cloth. Our footsteps no longer echoed properly. They came back distorted, delayed, almost like something was walking just a step behind us. Mason laughed nervously and said maybe it was a bat or an animal, but I saw his hand trembling when he adjusted his flashlight. The beam flickered as we reached the archway that opened into the long hall. It stretched maybe 50 yards, lined with doorways that led into small patient rooms. The ceiling was arched, with old fluorescent light fixtures dangling uselessly. The walls were covered in scribbles, names, dates, strange shapes that looked like eyes. Mason grinned and said, "Let's see if the stories are true." Before I could stop him, he shouted his own name down the corridor. His voice bounced off the walls and vanished. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then a whisper floated back, faint but unmistakable. His name backward. He laughed at first, said it was just an echo, but his face changed when the whisper came again. Louder, closer, like it was standing right next to him. He stepped back, shining the light around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hall and peeling walls. I told him we needed to go, but he said he wanted to record it. He pulled out his phone and hit record, saying my name this time. The air seemed to move, and the whisper came back. Not just once, but layered, overlapping, dozens of voices murmuring the reversed version of my name all at once. I felt a sharp pressure in my ears, like being underwater. The lights on his phone glitched, and the recording cut off. He swore, smacked the phone, and it died completely. Then the whispers didn't stop. They started coming from every direction. Not just the hall, but from the rooms on both sides. It was like hundreds of mouths were pressed to the walls, speaking in a language made of reversed breath. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. Mason dropped his flashlight and the beam rolled across the floor, catching something in the corner of one of the rooms. A dark figure crouched against the wall, its head twitching side to side. We both froze. The whispers grew faster, rising to a hiss, and the figure lifted its head. There was no face, just a blur like melted wax. It opened its mouth and we heard every whisper merge into one long, reversed scream that hit us like a blast of heat. We ran. I don't remember how we made it back to the side door, only that Mason was behind me shouting, and then suddenly he wasn't. When I got outside, I turned back, but the hallway behind the doorway was empty. No light, no sound, just dark. I screamed his name until my throat hurt, but nothing answered. I called the police and they searched for 2 days before declaring him missing. They found his phone on the floor of the hall. The last recording was corrupted, filled with static and faint murmuring. One of the officers said you could hear something if you played it backward, but when they tried, the file crashed. That was 3 years ago. I moved out of Austin a few months later, but I still dream about that place. Sometimes I wake up to hear whispers near my bed saying my name in that same backward tone. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that what we heard was a trick of sound or air, but deep down I know better. There's something still alive in those halls, something that remembers every name that ever echoed there. A few weeks ago, I got a letter with no return address. Inside was a photo, one I never took. It showed the corridor in the hospital, with a shadow standing at the end. Beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, was a single word: Natan. I burned it immediately, but the smell of mildew and iron hasn't left my room since. The radio tower stands about 15 miles outside of Laredo, off a forgotten stretch of farm road that runs through mesquite scrub and sand. You can see it from Highway 359 if you look east at night, a thin red light blinking rhythmically above the dark. Most locals ignore it now. It's just one of those landmarks that fade into the background. But truckers, CB hobbyists, and late-night dispatchers in Webb County know the stories. They say if you tune to Channel 9 after midnight, when the static starts breaking like distant thunder, you can sometimes hear old dispatch calls, real voices, real reports conned from accidents that never happened. I used to think it was just another ghost story the Laredo drivers told. I worked for Webb County Emergency Services back in 2003, mostly covering the night shifts. I'd sit in the dispatch room under buzzing fluorescent lights, sipping burnt coffee, logging calls from wrecks or domestic disturbances. Sometimes the occasional coyote report from a rancher. It was routine work, until that one night when we lost signal with Unit 47. It was late August, the air thick and hot enough to make your uniform stick to your back. Around 1:15 a.m., static started cutting into Channel 9. Usually it's just feedback, but this time it sounded like a pattern, a soft warble followed by silence. Then a voice came through, faint and metallic. "Dispatch, this is 47 responding. Got a rollover on Farm Road 2047 about 2 miles east of the tower." I froze. Unit 47 had been decommissioned for years. The officer, Mike Ortega, had died in a wreck on that same stretch of road in 1987. At first I thought it was a prank, maybe another operator testing the frequency. I asked for identification, but the channel went quiet. Just static again. I noted it in the logbook, half embarrassed to write it down. But around 20 minutes later, we got a real call. A rollover reported near that same area. I drove out with a deputy named Morales. The night was dead still except for the cicadas. When we reached the coordinates, there was nothing. No debris, no tire marks, just gravel and dust. The radio tower loomed ahead of us, blinking red against the sky. Its base was surrounded by old chain link and a weathered sign that said, Laredo Transmission Facility. It was 1974. We got out, scanned with flashlights, and that's when Morales said he heard something. "Listen," he whispered. Through the static of the patrol radio, faint as a whisper, came a dispatch transmission, same metallic tone. Unit 47 confirming rollover. 2 DOA. Requesting tow. The voice was calm, clipped, professional. Ortega's voice and unmistakable. Morales looked at me, his eyes wide. "You heard that, right?" I nodded. But when we checked the channel list, Channel 9 wasn't even active on our current system. The repeater had been removed years ago. Over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about that night. I went back during off hours, parked near the tower, and scanned the frequencies. Usually all I'd get was wind and faint hum from power lines. But sometimes if the air was still enough, I'd hear fragments. Pill up on 83 southbound. A requesting coroner. Time of death. Fire at the refinery. Multiple casualties. I'd cross-check every one of those calls. None matched any incident. Not that day, not that year. It was like listening to echoes from some alternate past. One night I brought a tape recorder and left it running in my truck while I sat under the tower. The wind was dry, the kind that carries dust and electricity. Around midnight, the red light above me began to flicker faster than usual, like it was stuttering. Then the radio kicked in, loud and clear. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Major collision at the intersection near the Laredo bypass. Multiple fatalities. Requesting assistance. I recognized that voice too. It was Officer Jimenez, my training partner. The problem was Jimenez wasn't on duty that night. He was home with his family. I drove back to the office and checked the logs. Nothing, no collision, no dispatch, no record of any call from Unit 12. But I played back my tape. And the recording was there, and his voice. The coordinates, even background noise like distant sirens. The next morning I showed it to the supervisor. He listened, frowned, and told me to erase it. Said we weren't supposed to log paranormal interference. He called it crosswave contamination. Something about old analog signals bouncing between repeater towers. But he looked uneasy when he said it. The next night, there really was a crash at that same intersection. A drunk driver ran a red light. 3 people died. After that, I stopped treating it as coincidence. I started listening, really listening, to the static. The transmissions always came between midnight and 3 a.m., always in the same faint metallic tone, always from units long retired. I started writing them down. The times, the coordinates, the voices, and almost every time within 24 hours something happened in that area. It wasn't like the tower was predicting the future. It was like it was remembering something that hadn't happened yet, like it was broadcasting dispatches from another version of Webb County, one where all those tragedies had already played out. By November, I was obsessed. My coworkers noticed. I barely slept. I'd park near the tower most nights, radio on, notebook open. One evening, a storm rolled in from the south. The sky turned the color of lead and lightning flared across the plains. I was sitting in my truck when the channel burst alive, louder than I'd ever heard. Dispatch, multiple officers down. Fire in the communications building. Tower compromised. Then silence. I stared at the tower, its red light blinking erratically through the rain. My chest tightened. I didn't even realize I was crying until I saw the notebook trembling in my hands. When the storm cleared, I drove back to the station. Everything was fine. No fire, no injuries. I told myself it was just another false signal. A week later, an electrical surge hit the dispatch center. Faulty wiring, they said. It started a fire in the communications wing. 3 operators died. I quit the next day. For years, I tried to forget it. I moved to San Antonio. Took a desk job with a private ambulance service. But sometimes when I drive home late, I still keep a CB in the car, just in case. Last month I was passing through Laredo again. I hadn't planned it, just took a wrong turn after a fuel stop. I saw the faint red light blinking out there beyond the mesquite. I pulled over, rolled down the window, and turned the knob to channel 9. The static came immediately. Then a voice. Dispatch, this is Unit 14, copy. 1 fatality reported. Victim identified as former dispatcher. Caused single vehicle collision near radio tower. I felt the blood drain from my face. The coordinates matched exactly where I was parked. I turned off the radio, threw it into the passenger seat, and drove. I didn't look back, not once, not even when the red light faded in the rearview mirror. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it. That faint hum, that distant metallic voice calling out through the static, reporting tragedies that never happened. Not yet. Late in the evenings, when the heat still clings to the cracked sidewalks of Dallas and the cicadas drone like distant static, there's a stretch of road near Rosedale Avenue that people drive faster than they mean to. They might not notice the fenced lot behind the line of mesquite trees, its gate chained but never really locked. Beyond it stands what's left of the Rosedale orphanage, a 2-story skeleton of red brick and soot, half-eaten by vines, windows gaping like sockets, and the faint smell of something burnt and sweet always hanging in the air. Locals say if you go there after dark and bring candy, you'll hear the wrappers crinkle, and sometimes the laughter of children who aren't there anymore. When I was younger, I didn't believe any of it. It was one of those urban legends that floated around high schools, the kind kids told each other while parked near White Rock Lake or at late-night bonfires. But in 2018, while working for a small local paper, I was assigned a Halloween piece, something light and regional, my editor called it. The idea was to dig into local ghost stories and trace the real history behind them. The Rosedale Orphanage was supposed to be a quick paragraph, maybe a photo of the ruins. I didn't expect to spend the night there. I didn't expect to hear what I did. The city records were vague. The orphanage opened in 1926, run by the Sisters of Mercy, and burned down in 1963. The fire, according to the Dallas Morning News Archive, was blamed on faulty wiring. 17 children died, trapped in their dormitory. Only 2 survivors were named, both too young at the time to remember much. The site was never rebuilt. For decades it sat fenced off, occasionally attracting taggers or ghost hunters. A few neighbors filed complaints about trespassers, but no one wanted the land. The city finally stopped trying to sell it around 1999. I arrived just before dusk, the sun sinking behind a wash of low clouds. The building's charred bones looked like they'd been standing since the Civil War. I parked across the road and slipped through a gap in the fence with my flashlight, camera, and a handful of miniature chocolate bars I'd picked up from a gas station. The grass was waist-high, full of burrs and tiny white moths that fluttered up with every step. The air felt wrong, humid but still, and carried a faint metallic tang like pennies left in the rain. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. No crickets, no cars from the highway. Just the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional groan of shifting metal as the wind caught some piece of the building. The orphanage's front doors were long gone, replaced by 2 empty frames leading into a hall of dust and shadow. The interior walls were cracked and painted with graffiti, but here and there you could still see old murals, faded scenes of smiling children holding hands beneath a painted sun. The floorboards creaked and the smell of old smoke seemed to thicken the deeper I went. I found the old dining hall first, a long rectangular space with a collapsed ceiling and rusted metal chairs frozen in the ash. The walls were streaked black, and something about the room made my throat feel dry, as if breathing there was harder than it should have been. I pulled out one of the candy bars, unwrapped it, and left it on a broken table, just for the sake of the story. I told myself it was for the photo op, but deep down I think I wanted to test the legend. I set my recorder on the table beside it, then walked back into the hallway to explore the rest. The dormitory wing was upstairs, but the staircase had partially caved in. I climbed carefully, the wood flexing under me. The second floor was worse off. Half the roof was gone, and moonlight spilled in through jagged holes, illuminating rows of blackened bed frames. Some still had springs attached. Others were just shapes in the soot. I took a few photos and sat down near a window, listening. That was when I heard it, the faintest crinkle of something soft close by, like paper being handled gently. It came from the direction of the dining hall downstairs. I froze, thinking maybe the wind had moved the wrapper. But the air was still again. The sound came again, this time longer, deliberate, like someone was unwrapping candy very slowly just to see if I'd notice. I went back down. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, catching dust floating in long ribbons. The candy was still on the table, but the wrapper had been peeled halfway open. My recorder was still on, red light blinking. I picked it up, checked the screen. The timer showed it had been recording for about 20 minutes. I stopped it and played the audio back through the built-in speaker. The first few seconds were just background noise, my footsteps, my breathing, the wind. Then faintly a laugh, high-pitched. A child's laugh, short and sudden like someone giggling into their hands. Then silence again. I stood there for a long time trying to tell myself I'd imagined it. But the recorder didn't lie. The sound was too clear. I pocketed it and looked around the room. The air had grown colder, noticeably so, enough to make my breath visible. I told myself it was the weather, though it had been nearly 70 degrees when I arrived. Then came the second sound. This time not laughter, but footsteps, light shuffling, running, across the hall, somewhere near the front entrance. I turned toward the noise, the beam of my flashlight jerking over the walls, and caught a glimpse of something darting past the far doorway, small, low to the ground. A shape, maybe the size of a child, gone before I could focus on it. I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. just the faint echo of it bouncing back. The rational part of my mind screamed that maybe it was another trespasser, a homeless person or some kid sneaking around. I wanted to believe that. So I went toward the doorway. The hall beyond it led to what used to be the nursery. The door was gone, but there was a faint smell of wax and something sweet, like burnt sugar. My flashlight dimmed for a moment, flickered back. The walls here still had peeling wallpaper, yellow with faded ducklings and stars. And there in the corner was something that made me stop breathing. A small pile of candy wrappers, all different kinds. Old and new, some rusted shut with age, others still shiny and recent, like someone had left them there just days ago. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, crumpled together. I crouched, trying to make sense of it. My camera clicked as I took a picture, though my hands were trembling so bad the image probably blurred. Then I heard whispering. Not words exactly, just the soft murmur of several voices overlapping. Faint and high, like a classroom full of children telling secrets. It grew louder the longer I knelt there until it seemed to come from every wall, every corner of the room. I turned off the flashlight instinctively, and in the darkness I could see faint shapes moving. Small figures, pale and translucent, gathering near the pile of wrappers. They weren't solid, not quite. More like smudges of light that shimmered when they moved. I stumbled backward and the recorder fell from my pocket, clattering against the floor. The whispering stopped. The shapes froze. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, a single shrill scream tore through the silence. A child's scream so sudden and piercing it made my ears ring. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran, tripping over debris, down the hall, through the shattered doorway, across the field to my car. I didn't look back. When I got home, I plugged in the recorder again. Most of it was static, but right after the sound of the candy wrapper, just before the laughter, I heard something else I hadn't noticed before. A voice, faint, a whisper, saying, we're still hungry. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I went back to the orphanage in daylight with 2 police officers. I told them I'd found evidence of trespassers, maybe squatters. But when we got there, the candy wrappers were gone. The pile in the nursery was gone. The entire floor, in fact. Looked like no one had been there in years. The officers humored me for a while, then told me to head home and let the dead rest. I submitted my article but cut that part out. The editor published it as a short local piece, 3 paragraphs, no mention of what I'd actually heard. I tried to forget about it, but every so often, when I'm driving through that part of town, I think I hear something faint in the background, soft, muffled laughter on the car radio even when it's turned off. And once, parked at a stoplight near Rosedale, I could have sworn I smelled burnt sugar again. I looked in the rearview mirror and for just a second I saw a small face in the back seat, smiling at me through a shimmer of static air. When I blinked, it was gone, but on the passenger seat, where there had been nothing before, lay an old half-crushed candy wrapper. It was open, and something had taken the candy. The mine sat deep in the scrubland outside Llano, a place most folks only mentioned when telling ghost stories or trying to scare kids out of wandering too far. It wasn't on any official maps anymore, but locals called it the Caldwell Mine, after the family that had owned it in the late 1800s. There were stories, of course, about the last group of miners who'd gone in one summer morning and never come out. They said the foreman's wife waited by the entrance until dusk, calling their names, and that when she finally went down to look, she found only the faint sound of pickaxes somewhere in the deep dark, echoing like whispers through the rock. She went mad not long after. I didn't believe any of that when I first heard it. I was in Llano working a seasonal construction job, living out of a cheap motel off Highway 16. I'd stop by a little diner on Main every night, and that's where I met Travis, a wiry old man who looked like he'd spent most of his life breathing dust and drinking coffee thick enough to chew. He told me about the Caldwell Mine after I mentioned I liked exploring old sites. "You stay away from that hole," he said, setting down his cup. "Men went in there and got swallowed whole. Place hums at night. Ground's got a memory and it don't forget." A week later, on a sweltering Saturday, I decided to find it. Curiosity's always been my curse. I asked around, but most folks either didn't know or didn't want to say. Eventually, a kid at the gas station told me there was an overgrown trail off an old ranch road about 10 miles west. He said if I followed it long enough, I'd find what I was looking for, though he didn't think I'd want to. The sun was high when I parked my truck near a rusted gate and started walking. The brush was thick, mesquite, and prickly pear tearing at my jeans. After about half an hour, the ground began to dip and I found the entrance, a jagged maw in the side of a limestone hill, half hidden behind a collapsed timber frame. The air pouring out of it was cool and stale, carrying the smell of old earth and rusted metal. I could almost hear something faint like metal tapping far below. I told myself it was dripping water. Inside, it was darker than any night I'd ever known. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, illuminating rotten beams and forgotten tools. There were initials carved into the wooden supports. Dates from 1893, 1894. The mine sloped down in a twisting path, and the deeper I went, the more I felt a pressure, like the air itself was heavy with something unseen. The sound of my boots on gravel echoed, but sometimes I swore I heard other footsteps too, just a beat behind mine. After maybe an hour, I found a chamber where the tunnel split 3 ways. There were lanterns on the ground, old ones, the kind with glass long fogged with soot. They were arranged neatly in a circle as if someone had set them down and stepped away. My flashlight flickered, and when it came back, I thought I saw movement down the left tunnel, a shadow shifting against the stone. I called out, "Hello?" My voice bounced back, warped and hollow. That's when I heard it, the distinct ring of metal striking rock. Then another, slow, steady, rhythmic. Pickaxes. It was coming from somewhere deep in the mine. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I had to know. I followed the sound, careful with my steps, the air growing colder with every yard. The noise grew louder, clearer, but the tunnel began to narrow. My flashlight caught a faint shimmer on the walls, tiny veins of silver still embedded in the rock. Then the floor dropped out slightly and I found myself in another cavern, this one much larger. The noise stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then from somewhere in the dark came a voice. It was low and raspy, like someone speaking through layers of dust. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, the beam of my light trembling. The tunnel behind me was empty. The voice came again, closer this time. "Leave while you can." The flashlight dimmed again and I smacked it against my palm. When it flared back to life, I saw them. Dozens of figures scattered through the cavern, frozen mid-motion, each one clutching a pickaxe or a shovel. Their skin looked like stone, gray and cracked. Their eyes hollow pits that caught the light but reflected nothing. I stumbled backward, my throat tight. The sound of metal resumed, but none of them moved. The clanging came from inside the walls themselves, echoing like trapped thunder. Something shifted near my feet. I looked down and saw a helmet half buried in the dirt. It was dented, and when I brushed it off, I saw the name etched faintly into the metal. T. Caldwell. The ground beneath it vibrated. Dust rained down from above. The figures' heads began to turn toward me, slow and creaking like ancient hinges. One of them, closest to me, opened its mouth and a sound came out. Not words, but a long, drawn-out groan that rose and fell like wind through a tunnel. I ran. The mind seemed to twist and change as I went. Passages I didn't remember opened where others should have been. My flashlight flickered more violently, and in those brief flashes of darkness I caught glimpses of faces in the rock. Eyes pressed against the stone as if watching me pass. I don't know how long I ran before I saw daylight ahead, but when I burst out of that tunnel I fell to the ground gasping, the heat of the sun hitting me like salvation. I drove straight back to town without looking in the rearview mirror once. That night I packed my bags and left Llano altogether. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my mind had played tricks in the dark. But sometimes when I can't sleep I hear it again, the slow, steady ring of a pick striking rock. Once I even went online to see if anyone else had talked about the mine, and sure enough there were threads and stories, people saying the same thing. That they'd gone out there and heard the miners still working, deep under the earth, forever trying to finish what they started. The strangest part is, last week someone posted a photo taken out by the hills. It showed fresh footprints leading toward where the entrance should be. The caption said the mine had caved in years ago, buried completely. But if you listened closely, the poster wrote, you could still hear the faint clanging echo from beneath your feet, like the earth itself was breathing. Sometimes when I think about that sound, I wonder if it's the miners I heard, or if it's something deeper, older, still digging its way up. I had been on the road long enough to learn the hill country by smell before I could see it. There is a sweetness out there between Fredericksburg and the peach orchards that rises after a day's heat, like syrup warming on a stove. and when the wind drops, it pools low along the bar ditches so a driver thinks the land is sighing. It was early March and the nights were still cool. The kind of cool that gathers behind the knees when you step out of a truck. And I had come back because my father's tools were stacked in a storage unit off Main, and the rent was past due. He had been a builder before his lungs turned to paper. He ran jobs from Kerrville to Johnson City, left his initials in pencil behind drywall, tucked into the cavities of houses where air runs thin and secret. He believed roads remember the weight that traveled them. He believed wood remembers hands. After he died, I felt every errand through this part of Texas as if I were pressing a bruise. The storage unit manager worked out of a small office that smelled like dried coffee and motor oil. He slid the corrugated door up and showed me the chaos inside. A nail gun still speckled with paint. Old blueprints rolled like bones. The battered wooden chest my grandfather had used for tack back when the family kept a few horses on a 5-acre lot outside Stonewall. The chest was what I really wanted. My father had hidden things in corners the way shy men hide their hearts. I lifted the lid and saw a folded leather pouch tied with a strip of rawhide. Inside were 3 coins and a brass button the size of a nickel, green with age, stamped with a star and a ring of dashes that looked like rays. I held it to the window and felt a current run up my fingers. The manager told me he'd give me a hand loading the heavier boxes after his smoke break. I told him to take his time. The light outside had gone soft by then, the particular Fredericksburg dusk that lays an amber glaze over limestone and live oak leaves, and I understood I would not be driving straight back to San Antonio. The land wanted something first. On the way out of town, I passed the Nimitz Hotel's pale facade and the wine bars where tourists took selfies with glasses held high. The laughter behind the glass looked like a painting hung on a wall, something you could take down with 2 hands. Out past the last traffic light, Main Street loosens into 290 and the hills begin to show their teeth, low and pale, chewed to nubs by wind. I took Ranch Road 1631 without thinking about it, the way a tongue finds an old chip in a molar. That road drifts across ranches patched with cedar, crosses a dry creek or two, and eventually stutters into a dirt track that the county still grades after big rains. My father called it the Phantom Coach Road, though on maps it had no name, only a skittering of dotted lines and a note about private property. He told me once that the German settlers had used it to reach a stage stop that served coffee, that tasted like boiled bark, and a pot of beans you could cut with a knife. He said the wagons and coaches had worried this soil deeper and deeper, until the rut itself became a thing you could fall into with more than your tires. He said that on some evenings the old coach came back along that crease. I turned off the pavement when the last mailbox lay behind me, and the truck shook itself into the language of washboard and dust. The sky was fading to a shade of blue that seemed to be listening. Grass heads flicked along the fence lines. The road narrowed between oaks whose roots had broken the earth and lifted it like a knuckle. In the bed of the truck, the wooden chest creaked when I hit certain bumps as if something inside were trying to sit up. I told myself I would drive until the last reach of light left the western fence line, and then I would turn around. I told myself that if there were a gate with a lock, I would stop before I touched it, because you do not trespass where fences are built by the same careful minds that wind clocks. But the gates I passed were left open, as if the land were shrugging and saying, "Do what you will." It happens at dusk, my father had said. It rolls low and gentle like a breath through a bottleneck. You think it is heat the way it shimmers, but it is not heat. He had been sober that evening, I remember. He had set his beer aside and tugged at a hangnail as if he were worried he might bleed, and his eyes had gone far. Some men invent a kingdom they can cry in. For my father, it was a dirt road and the sound of iron. When the truck's clock ticked toward 7 and the road faded to a double set of scars across a shallow rise, I eased to a stop. I killed the engine to hear the country. There were cicadas starting in the cedars and a distant metallic clink that might have been cattle nosing a trough. I told myself not to look at my phone because there is a special poverty in taking a picture of a place that is trying to make you a picture. The air was clean and carried a faint smell of stone. My own heartbeat sounded like a foot on stairs. I do not know what I expected. An apparition in the cartoon shape of a coach, like something from a novelty postcard with obvious edges. What arrived had no edges. The last band of light along the west thickened as if something were squeezing it from behind. The grass nodded without wind. Then the road 100 yards ahead of me deepened until it looked like a ribbon laid over a shadow. In that shadow, movement collected the way gnats collect above a bucket of water. It did not come from the horizon, but from the rut itself, as if the old road had exhaled a lungful of night. At first, I didn't see the shape of horses. I saw the shape of weight, which is to say the impression weight leaves behind it. Dust rose without cause and arranged itself into suggestions. Two necks bowed. A pole floated between. A box, not black, not white, but the color of breath on glass, swam forward and kept its angles by the stubbornness of memory. The wheels had spokes I could count and yet could not hold. They did not turn so much as repeat a circle. The whole thing glowed with a light that came from the mistake of naming it light at all. I told myself to step back to the truck, to put the metal of the door between me and this, because sometimes a little barrier is enough to give a man the dignity he needs to watch the world misbehave. But my feet stayed where they were because the sound came next, and the sound was a hand under my ribs. It was iron on iron, ring on ring, the patient drumming of hooves on packed dirt, the small collapses of leather, and the higher sound of reins drawn over a neck. There was a voice too, but it was not ahead in the box where a driver would sit. It was below, at ground level, where pressures change, and it spoke the way a spring speaks under a house when a heavy person crosses the floor above. Words live in the mouth. These sounds lived in the place that makes words. I knew then that if I turned my head too quickly, it would tear. Reality is held together by attention like a tablecloth held taut by four hands. I gave the moment what it asked. The team drew up 10 feet from my truck. Their nostrils did not flare because they had no nostrils. They were smoke with stubbornness, shaped by habit into animals that remembered they had been animals. The carriage body was plain, the sort that would have been hired by a family with enough to hide but not enough to boast. The lanterns at the corners were not flames but soft stains of paler dark. The driver did not turn to look at me because there was no driver, only the seat and the slight curve where a man's back had once taught a cushion the lesson of his spine. The door opened. It did not swing so much as choose a different position in the air. Inside was not darkness but depth, as if a room continued longer than the coach could hold it. A smell wafted that made my eyes burn. Old rain and wool. Mud that has been walked in a church. My father had said once that the worst smells are the ones that suggest the air is crowded. I could feel other breaths around me. I reached for the button in my pocket without thinking. The brass disc with its star, and it felt hot. I held it to see if the coach would flinch. The door widened. A woman spoke from inside with a voice that made a sound before it made sense, like water finding a gully. She said my name in a way that made the syllables seem older than me. Then she said the surname my father hated, the German one that his grandfather had scraped away by marrying into an English line and changing signs. I did not ask how she knew. I did not ask how any of this rose on a road that only knew boots and tires, and the small ambitions of men who needed a way from one fence to another. I did not move. It is possible to be invited by a place. You think it is a person calling, but the person is only the mouth. The road had called my father for years. He had come home from jobs out near Willow City with dust in his hair and a silence in his throat. He had sat on the back steps and watched our yard turn indigo, and you could tell he was going somewhere in his head no roof could cover. I had scoffed when I was younger because it is the privilege of sons to think their fathers are inventing a story, to justify all the ways they disappear. The woman's hand emerged. It was not bone and skin. It was the outline of the gesture hands make when they reach. She held nothing, and yet the nothing cupped like a gift. My father's button in my palm stung the way a cold thing stings when you first plunge it into warmer air. I said that I was only passing through. I said my father had watched this road. I said I was not his shadow. She told me a time and a county and a date when a coach had been taken not by robbers but by mistake. The driver had followed the ruts along a low stretch where fog pooled in depressions. He had trusted the habit of the road over the feel of the night, and the coach had steered itself into a creek that was not there during the day. The coach tipped and the door stuck. The horses thrashed until they tore themselves into lengths of something less than animal. The passengers did not drown. They breathed wet air until the air refused to be air at all. The mistake is what held them together. The mistake is what kept them full of a purpose that had nowhere to arrive. She asked if I would ride. She asked as if the asking had already been answered. In the bed of my truck, the wooden chest groaned again, and in that sound I heard the small complaint of a hinge that had long ago given a little too much. I thought about the way my father drove when roads went to dirt. He held the wheel lightly and let the ruts make their case. He said a road shows you how it wants to be taken. If you resist it, you will fight every 40 yards. If you give in, it will carry you. I looked down at the button and saw that what I had thought were rays were not rays at all, but little hash marks like stitches. I understood then that it had not been a uniform button from some company of rangers, as I had guessed when the light was good. It was a cufflink made to look like a button, without the weight of duty behind it. It belonged to someone who would ride quietly and not touch the window glass because that is what he had been taught. Someone who would carry a wrong lesson to the end of a road because he believed lessons were owed. I stepped forward, just 1 foot, and then the air tightened around my chest and pulled. A man cannot be prepared for the sensation of being accepted by something that is not a thing. The door grew wide enough to accept the width of my shoulders. The world smelled like a wool coat that had been dried by a fire. The seat inside pressed against my knees as if every mile the coach had ever traveled had been saved as pressure. There were other shapes around me. They were framed by hats and shawls that were not there, and held themselves with the patience of people who wait for trains that do not come. Across from me, something like a child the size of an age lay curled and breathing slowly. The air hummed with the sound of iron asking to be forgiven. The door arranged itself back into a closed shape without slamming. The coach moved. This is the part that the living misunderstand. The coach did not lurch, did not bounce on ruts. It moved by repeating a memory of moving. It slid. My body remembered motion and produced the proper fidgets to give me the courtesy of belief. I heard my own truck door creak behind glass that was not there, and I thought of the way a dog watches when you walk from one room to the next, and it cannot decide which absence to guard. The coach left the dirt road and entered a corridor made of the idea of dusk. It passed between cedar that wore a shine as if polished by years of glancing. The woman spoke again and asked if I knew why it glowed. I told her I did not. She said it was not light. It was expectation turned inside out. It was the coach's refusal to stop arriving. She asked if I would carry something where she could not. She said it had to be carried by someone who had a foot in the lithium blue of modern days, and a hand that still knew splinters. She told me the button in my palm was mine now if I wanted the old road to treat me kindly. She told me kindness and mercy are not synonyms. She told me that when I stepped back out, my footprints would show the length of a man who had been measured. The coach slowed near a stand of oaks that had grown together the way families do, twisting around one another until separation is only theoretical. The road beneath us widened back into the world. The sounds of cicadas and cattle and the faint whine of wires returned like a radio finding a station. The door opened. Cool air met my face and made the skin tighten along my jaw. I stood on the dirt again and the coach remained, hovering at the edge of the rut like a decision that has been made and is waiting for your personality to catch up. I asked what would happen if I refused to carry whatever had been asked. The woman's voice told me refusal is a path that wears quickly and then you fall through it. She told me to look to my truck bed. I turned and saw that the wooden chest had opened itself. The leather pouch lay on top, untied. The 3 coins were arranged in a line with the dates facing up. They were not American. They bore an eagle that had been simplified to the point of scorn and numerals that insisted on a history that had not happened here. They were stage money from a faith, minted for the weight in a man's palm and not for its use in any store. They were the kind of money you take with you across an ocean, because you cannot bear to part with the idea that someone owes. Beneath them, wedged in the corner of the chest, was a rectangle wrapped in paper stiff as dried skin. I lifted it. The tape had melted into the paper and the two divorced with a sound like a breath drawn in through teeth. Inside was a sepia photograph of an unremarkable coach. 4 people stood beside it with faces like closed doors. The driver kept his hat low. A boy in a wool cap looked at the ground with the solemn concentration of someone memorizing dust. A woman wore a dress with a collar that reached the bottom of her throat, and she held one hand at her side in a way that suggested something small, nestled between her fingers. The 4th figure had his arm half inside the coach, as if he were either about to climb in or had already begun to step out and was caught in the polite lie of a pose. His cuff bore a round glint. The brass mark on it had been carefully painted over, but paint only humbles metal for so long. My father's notes were scrawled on the back, letters bent by the pressure of a hand that did not like the job. Stage stop east of town, found behind false wall at Stam Farm remodel. Return to owner? Then in a different pen many years later. Roads keep what they kill. I had to sit down after I read that because the word kill sounded wrong and right at the same time. The coach had not killed anyone. It had simply insisted. Insistence is a more patient kind of violence. My father would have known that some debts are collected by being remembered too hard. Took the coins and the photograph to the coach and held them out, the way you hold out water through a fence to an animal you don't want to spook. The woman's voice said I was not to return them. She said I was to carry them to a place with electric lights and walls that could be washed. She said I was to walk them into a room where glass kept dust off names, and where children were taught the difference between souvenir and relic. She said I would leave them there with a note that did not confess but described. She said the note would mention a road by its habits and not by its map. She said the coins in the photograph would be happier behind glass because glass is a kind of admission. I asked what I would be given in return. She told me I would be allowed to keep the button. She told me it would keep me from being pulled into places that refused to learn my name. She told me the button was not protection but identification. She said we are all allowed one object to carry that allows the hungry parts of the world to recognize us as belonging elsewhere. She said the price of this anchor was simple. When the road asked for me, I would answer by stepping to the side so it could go through me. She said when I heard iron ring far away without cause, I would stand still until the sound stopped and then take 3 steps backward to give the echo room. She said I must never speak the word that begins with G and ends in ost when the rut darkened, because names are invitations. The coach leaned forward then, as if to bow, and slid back into the crease of the road. The horses of smoke raised their heads as if a scent had opened in the earth. The lanterns at the corners dimmed by remembering less. The wheel shapes repeated their circles past where the dust thickened. Then there was only the rut and the pink last smear of sunset, and the smell of stone and the feel of a coin's edge against my thumb. I drove back to town with the photograph on the passenger seat, and every shadow along the fence lines looked like a thinner place where the wind could pass through. I slept in a motel that had a lock that was honest about how little it could do for you. In the morning, I went to the Pioneer Museum and waited until the doors opened, standing there with a styrofoam cup cooling in my hands. The woman behind the desk wore a name tag that made her sound like an ant. I put the photograph and the coins on the counter and told her I had found them in a remodel my father's company had done years ago. I signed a form. No one asked for more than my name and address. I wrote them carefully. I did not write down the road. The museum's air smelled like old paper blessed with air conditioning. In a glass case nearby, there was a bonnet that had survived children and a storm. The plaque said the family had come from far to farther and had paid for the distance with names and teeth. When I left the building, the day felt new in a way that made me tired. The button I kept in my pocket where my fingers could find it when I needed to be reminded of its small laws. Sometimes, late at night, driving home along the river where the highway slips between dark cypress, I would hear something like iron being asked a question. When I did, I would pull over and stand beside my truck and let it pass. I did as I had been told. 3 steps backward after the sound stopped. I wondered if an anchor can become a leash. I wondered if the difference is only the direction you are pulled. Once, late in summer, when the heat lasted past midnight and frogs accused each other in ditches, I took 1631 again. I did not plan it. My hands chose. The rut was there, of course, because roads do not quit unless someone teaches them a better job. I parked where the oaks knit their knuckles. Dusk was late, but when it came fast as if it had been waiting behind a curtain. The coach arrived without fuss. The door opened without anger. No voice called me by the names that made me young. It stood at a respectful distance like a hearse idling, and then it did a thing I had not seen. It went around me. It left me out. The way a story sometimes skips a detail that would bring it too close to being true. That was when I understood my father had done as I had done. He had carried something small into town and left it behind glass. He had kept his anchor. He had stood still when iron asked.
He had paid his tolls by being available to be passed through.
I tell you this only so you will know how to behave if you take that road by accident and dusk surprises you. Do not pretend you are not afraid. Fear that is treated like contraband grows teeth. Hold something honest in your hand, a button or a key or a coin you did not earn. Stand still when the sound comes. Not because stillness is brave, but because movement can look like consent. Let it roll by and do not count the spokes because counting is a kind of touch. If it opens its door, offer it a story it can carry into town. Give it something that would look good behind glass. The hill country keeps every mile anyone ever took through it. The roads remember the wait. Sometimes they send it back around to see who still belongs to it. If you give them a clean note and a name they can file, they will leave you on your side of the grass. I no longer keep my father's tools. I sold them to a kid with good hands and bad boots who wanted to build shelves for his sister's trailer. I told him to leave his initials behind drywall because marks belong to the places that hide them best. He laughed and said he would. I kept the brass button in a small dish by the door. When I leave the house after dark, I put it in my pocket and it warms as if it has a pulse. Some nights, if I hold it tight enough, I can feel the coach drift past the far edge of the neighborhood where the developers left a strip of old fence to satisfy a rule. The air gets careful. The streetlights soften as if embarrassed by how young they are. And for a few seconds, I can hear a voice say my name through the floor of the world, not asking me to come, only reminding me that the roads do not end. They only enter rooms where our feet have not yet learned the furniture. If I stand still, if I hold my anchor and keep my mouth closed on the wrong word, the night moves on. Somewhere out along 1631, a rut deepens without breaking. Horses that are only smoke repeat their obedience, pulling what has never stopped arriving toward a stop that knows better than to be final. And the land, patient as a chest that waits in a storage unit, gives a little creak, the sound a hinge makes when it remembers why it was built. My father used to say you could hear the difference between a Texas train and an Arkansas one, by the way. The whistle feathered off the pine. He claimed the trees on the Arkansas side were a touch tighter, that the sound ran along them like fingers on a washboard, while the Texas trees took it in smooth and long, bass deep enough to sit in your ribs. He said this when he was sober and when he was not, and he said it even after the last tracks in the Texarkana fields were pulled and sold for scrap. He said it standing behind the bait shop where he worked after the plant closed, and he said it on our back steps while I watched the glow of Highway 67 pulsing red through the summer dust. He kept saying it until he died in a little duplex near Wake Village with a box fan shaking in the window. The man had lost jobs, teeth, and a wife, but he never lost the belief that sound remembered what people forgot. The first time I heard the whistle, I was 16 and should have been asleep. Our place sat on the Texas side where the land flattens into pasture, and the sky can look so wide it has the arrogance of an ocean. It was late August, the kind of heat that gets into the drywall and hums. My room faced the backfield. There was a line of mesquite and an old barbed wire fence that served no purpose but to catch ragged plastic bags and the occasional hawk feather. In the distance were the factory stacks near the state line, the low red blink of their warning lights making a slow beat that once matched the schedule of freight that had followed a right-of-way carved long before I was born. By the time I was old enough to care, the ties had been torn out, the ballast scraped into pale mounds that spring grass claimed like graves. I woke because the air went different. People who never lived where trains ran don't understand it. The air thickens first, then thins as if the yard itself has chosen a direction to lean. You feel a low thrum before your ears decide to recognize it. Then the long descending call. A whistle shaped by a human hand. A voice taught to be polite to crossings and impatient with animals. It keeps its manners even in the middle of the night. The alarm clock read 2:13. The whistle hung there, long and real. It felt like a thread somebody flicked across my teeth. I went to the window and stared out at the field where no train had any right to be. There was nothing at first. Then a smear of light moved past the mesquite like a silverfish in a sink. It went from my right to my left, which made no sense because the old right-of-way had run the opposite direction. It was quick and quiet and wrong. It slashed through the summer insects and took their noise with it for a breath. And in that hush, I swear I heard the soft automatic clank of couplers shifting in a long line. It was a private sound, the sound a thing makes to itself as it works. My skin rose with the idea that there were cars behind that light stacked with lumber or pipe or grain, all the goods of a country, all of them invisible and going nowhere. In the morning, my father looked at me over Folgers and said I had finally heard it. His eyes were red, but his smile had the strength of a man happy to share a secret. He told me folks had heard the whistle every year since before he was a boy. Always on the same night if you were patient enough to count. Always at 2:13, and always moving against the way it should. He said it was a joke of the land, or a memory, or a warning. He told me if I saw the lights again not to wave. Don't you flag a thing that doesn't have weight under it, he said. It might try to take some from you. He died 3 summers later, and grief made the world skeletal for a while. Everything reduced to what supported what. I got a job changing oil at the shop off New Boston Road, and moved into the duplex he had left behind. I brought my father's coffee can of screws and keys and put it on the windowsill, like it might hold the place together. The evenings sank into a rhythm I could manage. I ate out of paper bags and watched the freight lines on YouTube, long videos where someone had filmed real trains roaring past some normal crossing in Ohio or North Carolina, metal on metal singing out its ancient need for forward motion. It satisfied and bent the ache in me at the same time. I told myself tales about getting on a westbound with a backpack and a grin. I knew how to change a tire and a life. Then the rent came due and so did my mother's medicine, and I set the tales aside like pennies sorted by date. The summer I turned 22, the whistle came back like a debt collector. I had almost forgotten the clock of it. I woke into that taut, excited air and felt my heart answer, a dog barking at a knock. The fan pushed warm air over my chest. The digits on the nightstand showed 213 with a little red insistence that made my throat tighten. The light out in the field moved fast and thin. This time I stepped outside, bare feet on plywood, door closing like a cough behind me. The yard smelled like hose water and earth. A Whataburger cup rolled across the concrete as if nudged by a patient foot. The light came again. Not a headlight exactly. Not the oval glare you get from a proper locomotive, and certainly not the yellow of the old Southern Pacific pictures my father kept in a mildewed album. It was whiter, thinner and cleaner, as if it had been wrung out of something instead of generated. It came with the sound of distant weight, the low murmur of power being applied, the quiet clatter of iron working through its own limitations. It traveled where grass grew and the grass leaned as if pressed by wind. I saw in that wrong light the suggestion of ties where there were none, darker rectangles in the field that kept their spacing like soldiers. I stood there and did not wave. The light passed and did not slow. A mosquito bit the back of my knee and reminded me that I was a man wearing nothing but boxers, and a stubborn belief that experience is the only thing that matters. The air recovered. Crickets attempted their song again with a shakiness that made me want to apologize to them. The next day I drove out along old farm roads to see where the right-of-way might have gone. The sky felt stretched. Nobody has a monopoly on wide sky, but Northeast Texas takes a great pride in a wall of blue that goes on too long to be reasonable. I stopped near a pasture that belonged to the Durhams, who tolerated my father and were kindly toward me in the way of people who have fenced the same rectangle of land for 3 generations. Old Mr. Durham was stacking feed in the bed of his truck, with the slow dignity of men who have learned their body's complaints by name. I asked him if he remembered the tracks. He said he did, and that they had run straight as a preacher through here until the year the derailment made the papers. I waited. He placed a sack, patted it, then told me he had not seen it himself but that his brother had. According to the brother, a night train had left the rails on the state line side in a low fog. No one died, which is the kind of miracle that makes people suspicious. They pulled the cars, burned the ties, and left the bed where it was because the land had been leased and the lease was up. He told me sometimes he heard things around August and let the dogs in early. He said he did not wave either. Then he told me a story I had not asked for, which is how you know it matters. He said his mother had been a girl when a man came walking down the right-of-way, as if led by the hand. He wore a suit too hot for the weather and carried a hat he did not put on. He asked if he might have a drink of water and if he might rest under their oak. He spoke like he had to choose each word from a shelf and wanted to return it unscuffed. His shoes were dusty with something finer than the county could make. He sat under the tree without leaning back and thanked them until his voice wore out. When he fell asleep, his hands kept flexing like a man trying to grip a thing he cannot see. They woke him when it was near dark. He stood, put his hat on at last, and said he must catch the late one. He walked away on the right-of-way and reduced himself to a thin line in the heat. They found his jacket draped over the fence the next day. No man to claim it. Ticket in the pocket for a train that did not stop anywhere nearby. Old Mr. Durham told me sometimes he thought that was the same kind of thing as the whistle, and sometimes he thought it was only the way memory invents a companion to explain a sound. He did not want to know which. On my way home, I stopped at the Texarkana Museum of Regional History because there is always one person in town who keeps a key to what it used to be. In the freight section, in a corner of a corner, behind a laminated poster about the St. Louis Southwestern, there was a gray box of photographs that smelled like someone's sunroom. I turned through black and white pictures of men leaning against parts of America they had made stand still. A volunteer with hair the color of onion skin told me about a short-lived run called the Blue Comet that had passed through our county in the 50s hauling express and mail. She told me about a later line that tried to make the schedule before the highways came and made the schedule for everybody. I asked if she knew anything about a derailment at night in fog. She nodded and said she had a copy of the article somewhere, but could not find it now. She asked me to come back when she did. I promised. I meant it, and I never did. I started sleeping badly near August. When I did sleep, I dreamed of things that choose what track they ride because someone somewhere has given up their say. In one dream, the land itself had rails stitched through it, and the trains were the thought of a nation moving through the body of a county. In another, I walked beside a fence line that ran forever, and did not learn anything more about it than that it ran forever. The whistle in the dreams came from inside my chest. You don't need a therapist to tell you I missed my father. The next time I heard it, I decided to record it. There's a kind of pride in proof. You want to be the one to turn the rumor into a file. I set my phone on the sill at 2:05. I poured coffee I did not need and sat by the open window with the lights off. The night carried in smells from the field that were not smell but suggestion, a catalog of heat, weeds, and the last sour breath of sun-warmed dirt. I sat so straight I hurt. When the air changed, I raised the phone like a microphone and felt foolish and righteous at the same time. The whistle came dead on 2:13. My phone recorded my own sharp inhale first, then the sound as it moved across what used to be. The light came low and thin and made the dust under my neighbor's Dodge blush. It slid so close to the edge of my porch that for a second, everything in me wanted to reach, to touch the front of it, to greet it like a thing returning. I kept my hands to myself. There was a tug in my shoulders like the one you get when a current catches you at the lake, and you realize how much water can hold. The light cut under the hackberry and heaved the lawn shadows up and over like someone flipping a tablecloth. Then it was through. The night backfilled itself with cricket and leaf. The clock said 2:14 as if nothing sacred had happened. I looked down at the recording and felt the particular dread of catching something you cannot explain, with a sound you know in your teeth. I listened to it the next day at the shop, because men who deal with oil like to lean on counters and solve things. I played it for Clay and for Jorge, and for a man whose name I had never learned because he only came in for filters and spoke 3 sentences in a year. They all nodded at the whistle at first like they wanted to get past the polite part of the conversation. Then their faces changed the way people look when they see a photograph of their street in a book about a hurricane, familiar in a way they did not grant permission for. Clay told me it sounded like a recording of a recording. Jorge told me it sounded like the whistle was not outside but near the phone, like you had put the horn under a blanket. The quiet man asked what time it was. When I said it, he nodded like I had guessed right on a test. He had grown up in a house near Summerhill Road and had heard it too. He said his father threw a beer at it one year and broke a garden gnome. He said his mother prayed. He said he moved away for a while and still woke at 2:13 with a pressure in his ears. He said it settled down when he came back. We started making a joke of it. I would glance at the corner clock in the shop around 2 in the afternoon and say I had a meeting later. Clay would ask if he should bring ear protection. It was the sort of humor you manufacture to speak around a thing that frightens you into silence. On the night of August 30th, the year I thought I had finally balanced my mother's pills and my own debts, I heard someone knock on my back door at 2:07. A sensible man calls the police. I am sensible most of the time. This time I opened it because my father never did and I am not him. There was a boy there muddy to the knees. He was maybe 10 if you judged by the clothes and maybe 100 if you judged by his expression. He held something close to his chest and stared at me like a dog making up its mind about a stranger. He said he was lost and had been walking a long time and could he please rest for a while. He had no accent I could place and yet he sounded like he belonged anywhere you set him down. I asked where he was headed and he said he had to catch the late one. He looked past me into the kitchen the way you look at a waiting room. Not at anything in particular, but at the space where waiting might fit. I told him it was late and asked who his parents were. He said carefully that he had been in the car with his mother, but that the car had fallen quiet when the man with the flag had waved. He spoke like he was pulling words out of a file cabinet and wanted to replace them in order. I asked about the flag. He said it was red in the dark. He said the man had waved it and then stood on the dirt and did not look at them anymore because he was busy watching the light. He said his mother thought the man would come check on them after the light went by. Then he said his mother had fallen asleep and he had waited for the man with the flag, and then he had started walking. I should have called someone. I should have asked him to sit and drink water and dialed every sheriff from here to the line. I let him into my kitchen because he was muddy and little, and the whistle would come whether I made phone calls or not. He held his bundle tighter and I saw it was a jacket, old and brown, the kind of wool that makes you itch just to see it. He stood, not sitting, as if he believed that to sit might commit him to something he had not agreed to. I gave him a glass of water. He did not drink it yet. He said thank you with grave care. I asked his name. He opened his mouth and the whistle came in through the window and into his answer. He snapped his jaw shut like a man who has swallowed something too hot. The air went the way it goes. The clock blinked at me in the dumb confidence of machines. I stood there with a child who might not be a child and a light that might not be a light on its way. The yard outside showed its edges, as if the night had made a point of remembering what belonged to it. The boy looked toward the back door so hard I thought he might walk through it without moving. I told him to stay put. He told me he had to go. I asked him where. He said the late one. He pronounced it with a weight that made it a proper name. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder because I have learned to stop people from walking into traffic that way. He looked up at me with a certainty I have only ever seen in men getting married or buried. He said it was already here. The light passed the mesquite and lifted my shadow up onto the ceiling where it stuck like a stain. It came so close that my hair stirred as if brushed by an airstream. There was a waver in it, a human uncertainty, the way the hand on a horn lifts and sets again, apologetic to nobody. In that light for a second, the kitchen looked like a depot, and my table looked like a bench that had been varnished by decades of backsides, and the counter looked like a ticket window where no one ever closed the little brass circle. The boy stepped forward and my hand slid off his shoulder because there was nothing to catch. He held the jacket tight and went into the light without opening the door. His shoes made no sound. The light moved on and took a smear of the room with it. For a second, the paint forgot what color it was. Then I had my kitchen back. And I stood with a glass of water that had collected 3 pale mosquitoes that had not existed moments before. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning I told myself it had been a dream, though my feet felt gritty and the back door was still open an inch like a mouth debating a sentence. I went outside and looked for prints in the dust and found only a pattern like somebody had dragged a broom across without touching. I wanted my father so badly I nearly went to his grave to speak to him out loud. I did not do that. I did what I always do when something buckles under me. I went to work. I told nobody. I let it sit in me like a seed that had not chosen its weather. That afternoon, the paper ran a small story about a mother and child who had not returned from a visit to relatives on the Arkansas side. It was the kind of inch-deep tragedy local papers specialize in, a column that feels like the town is apologizing for not being able to keep track of its own. The names were generic enough to forgive me the panic I felt. The dates did not line up cleanly. The picture of the mother was older than it should have been. I told myself it was not them. I told myself I had not seen what I had seen. I went home and unplugged the clock and then plugged it in again like a man who thinks he can control the hour by changing the way it is displayed. When the whistle came the next night at 2:13, it came after a silence that carried the weight of attention. I stood in the dark and decided to face the field and not the kitchen. The light ran across and my eyes adjusted and then over-adjusted, and then I could see what I had refused to see on all the nights I had been braver in my denial. There were figures on the field. Not bodies, not shadows. Suggestions. Where the ties would have been, the grass seemed denser, darker, as if something pressed on it regularly. And between those darker bands there were waves. The kind weeds make when something fast moves past close to the ground. The light showed me the faintest trace of ballast pebbles that had not been there that afternoon. I swear I heard the quick rattle of loose nails in a pail somewhere low. I heard the polite cluck a conductor makes with his tongue to a man who is taking too long to decide whether to step up. It was the small human scaffold behind a machine's face. The combination of the two made me shiver so hard my teeth clicked. I tried to pray and discovered I'd forgotten how. The words would not come like they used to when I was a boy and my mother's hair still smelled like VO5 in church. I made up my own words and offered them to the air and hoped intention counted. I promised not to wave. I promised not to call out. I promised to keep my eyes on the ground like a respectful man does when a funeral passes. I failed. I lifted my head and looked straight into the light. It shuddered as if startled, and in that tiny human reaction I saw the truth I had been circling. There was no train. There was the shape a train leaves in a place it has been on time when people needed it. The groove in the world where something faithful had run, the habit the earth has of repeating what it has been asked to endure. It was a rut of reality. Sound remembered, my father said. He did not say that light does too. He did not say that if you step wrong near the rut you can slide in. I decided in a decision that feels like something that grew in me rather than a choice I made, to follow it. Not to run alongside it like a boy or to chase it like a man who doesn't understand the scale of his opponent, but to walk the right of way the next day and see where the rut led. I told myself I would take my father's jar of screws with me like an offering, in case the world noticed and needed a price. I slept an hour and woke with the kind of headache that feels like a ring around your head instead of a point. I tied on shoes. I tucked a bottle of water into my back pocket. I set out across the field and down to where the fence sagged, and I stepped over, careful not to tear my shorts, because small pains are indignities the big world doesn't deserve. The path is there if you agree to see it. Grass grows different in a place that has been compressed. The gullies mark where culverts still mean something. The ditch darkens where oil once leaked and made a stain down into the bones of the dirt. I followed these faint convictions down toward the tree line, past the Durham's pasture where a brown cow regarded me with the slow consideration cows pretend is disdain. I walked until I felt the familiar flicker of being watched by something too busy to be a watcher. I told myself what I always tell myself when I leave what I know. I am not trying to win. I am trying to understand. Under the shade of a stand of pine, the ground turned to the kind of duff that drinks your steps. I found old spikes in there, iron scabbed into lumps by rust. Impossible to tell whether they were artifacts of men or the earth's own efforts at making knots. I picked up one and felt the heat in it despite the shade and almost put it down, then slid it into my pocket like a thief who believes a punishment might explain a desire. I walked until the dry grate of cicadas gave way to a hush that felt manufactured. The right-of-way led me to a place where the trees parted enough to make a stage. In the middle of that stage was a rectangle of crushed stone that had no business still being there. It shone faintly, even without sun. I stood on it and felt a pressure in my ears like when an elevator starts. I felt a lightness in my hands like someone else was holding them at my sides. My head filled with the noise of machines, but not the noise they make when they are working, the murmur they make when they are waiting for instruction. A whistle, distant and formal, said its piece to a countryside that had already obeyed. The light that came then was weak, a daytime cousin to its midnight self, but it was enough to make the pine needles look like wires, and the leaves look like a schedule printed too small. I stood there longer than was reasonable and shorter, then felt respectful, and then I went home by a different way because sometimes retracing is salt in a wound. That evening I set my father's coffee can on the porch rail and told him what I had done. My voice wanted to shake. I would have let it if I had been kinder to myself. I told him I was thinking of leaving, of taking a job with a friend over near Dallas. I told him the money would be better, and that the nights might not be on a schedule I could not manage anymore. I told him I was afraid if I stayed I would wave, and if I waved something would wave back. I asked him for his opinion, which is something living people do not give. The air came off the field like the breath of a content animal. The sun went down with its usual plot. The light from Highway 67 did what it always does. I went inside and tried to make a future. At 2:13 the whistle asked its question. I had not packed. I had not called my friend. I had not done anything but put the spike I had taken on the kitchen counter like a paperweight for a piece of paper I hadn't written. The light came sleek and assured. The kitchen did its trick with depots and benches. I told myself to keep staring at the floor. It is hard to convince a man to look down when a miracle insists on passing by the edge of his life. I raised my head. In that modest lift I gave something permission. The light paused. It tilted the way a living thing tilts when it is trying to decide if you are tame. My skin prickled all at once as if each hair had remembered it had been asked to stand guard. The spike on the counter hummed low. My father's screw can rattled. The light brightened like a man drawing breath to speak. I heard the cluck. I heard the scrap of a boot on a step that had been burnt into ash. I heard a voice with the grain of tobacco call a name that was not mine, and sounded like it belonged to a person who had once owed me money. I heard another voice answer, resigned and eager as men can be when they have convinced themselves a duty will count as a decision. Then I heard my name, my full name, the one my mother used when she wanted me to stop playing with fire and come to supper. I heard my father's voice say it in the tone that forgave me and told me to hurry. I turned and the light made a little move like a nod. There is a way of stepping that is neither forward nor back. It is the motion of a man set on a moving walkway who has not yet chosen whether to walk. The floor is doing the work and you are doing the thinking. I made that step. My kitchen stretched. The sink lengthened like a platform receding at speed. The counter flattened into a long tar-black ribbon that had stones in it that remembered being riverbed. The clock threw itself away from me and then hung where it was, stubborn in its obedience to numbers. I felt the warm brush of air against my knees the way you do when you stand too close to the edge of a train as it enters a station. I took another step because I had already taken the first. The light opened its chest and made a pocket of space for me that smelled like sun-baked paint and good steel. In that smell was the taste of blood. Not because there was any, but because human bodies interpret certain metals as injury. It is a habit that has kept us cautious in places where caution might be too late. Something closed around my upper arms very gently, like a man guiding another man through a crowd. The pressure was not a hand, but a persistence. I thought of the boy in the jacket. I thought of the man under the Durham's oak who spoke as if he was afraid of scuffing words. I thought of my father's breath when he told me not to wave. I said his name out loud and the light flinched. It let me go. I stumbled back into my kitchen, bumping the table. The glass of water tipped and set a circle on the wood. The spike on the counter rang like a little bell. I stood there crying without surprise until my chest hurt for lack of air. Then I laughed because my body had to clear itself one way or the other, and I suppose laughter has less pride to swallow after. I left in October. I took the job near Dallas and told myself the whistle would miss me the way a tide misses a rock. My mother said she was proud in a voice that made me want to stay. The duplex looked bereft without my truck in front of it in the evenings. Clay texted me jokes about the late one. I did not mention the boy or the kitchen or the step a man can make when he thinks he is making no decision at all. I told myself reason had won. Then I learned something reason does not like to say out loud. The rut does not belong to a place. It belongs to something that learned to run a schedule. In a new apartment with new paint and a view of a Kroger parking lot, I woke on my first night to a whistle at 2:13. It was softer, polite like a knock on a neighbor's door rather than a command called across fields. The light that came was a timid cousin to the one at home, thin and careful as if it had to carry its own permission into a city that had never wanted it. It passed under my blinds and made a quick scan of my floor, and then went on in search of a man with a kitchen and a father in a field. I lay back and wished I could apologize for not being where it might have expected me. I had the sense of missing a ride you secretly wanted to make. I slept and dreamed of a platform where no one waits because arrival is not an option you can select. I lasted 8 months. In that time, I felt the whistle pass some nights and not others. It did not obey me, which felt like a relief and a grief in equal measure. In July, my mother called and told me the Durhams were selling the pasture to a man from Plano, who liked to say he was going to put a wedding venue there that would tastefully preserve the rustic charm. She said it like a thing that is both a joke and a dying wish. I told her I would come home to help put things in boxes. I told myself I was not going for anything else. It was hot enough to turn the inside of your nose to leather when I rolled into town. The sky did its big trick. The field did its simple one. The duplex looked smaller and braver than it had when I left. My father's coffee can was still on the sill because I had been better at packing clothes than ghosts. My mother hugged me and cried a little in a way that forgave me every absence and demanded nothing of me except to stand there. We ate fried chicken with our hands and let the box take the grease onto its cardboard. We talked about nothing worth reporting and found it good. At 2:13, the whistle asked if I had learned anything. I stood in the kitchen because a man can be courteous to a thing that has kept its appointments. The light came clean and quick and opened itself to take a look. I felt the compression of attention that comes when a dog recognizes your step on the other side of a door. I said out loud without shame that I was not waving. I meant it the way you mean a promise to a child. The light made the smallest motion of departure, the way a train shifts weight before getting out of a station. The spike on the counter hummed again, the way a hidden tuning fork might answer the low A in a choir. In that tone, I heard something I had missed in all my fear and theater. I heard a list, names being ticked off like another night's work. I heard men answer and not answer. I heard a conductor who was tired of speaking into air and grateful for the rhythm of saying anyway. Then I heard my father's voice, not speaking my name this time. He was speaking his own. He answered for himself, and his voice had the good humor of a man who has found a task suited to what he loves. He said here. He said present. He said on board. I was angry and comforted at once. That's the thing about home. It is the place that can tear you exactly in half. I stood with my hands on the table and told my father he had done a cruel thing not to tell me what he had signed up for. The light brightened and then dimmed a fraction as if a relay had clicked. The air stirred and settled. The list ran on. Names I did and did not recognize. I waded through them as a man at a crossing waits for a long freight, because what else is there to do? When the last name answered, the light did not leave right away. It hung there like a kindness. Then it went quick as always, and the kitchen shrugged off its borrowed station. I slept in my old room and dreamed of a boy weighing a jacket in his hands and deciding what weight was worth keeping. In the morning, I drove to the Durham's pasture and stood at the fence while men in polo shirts paced around with a tape measure and a liability smile. They talked about parking in terms that made my stomach hurt. Mr. Durham stood with his hands on his hips and did his best to look like a man who knows when to retire. I joined him and we stood quiet until they left. He asked me if the whistle had been on time. I said yes. He nodded like a man checking cows. He told me something then he had not told me before, which is how you know it mattered. He said his brother had gone away too, to a job in Little Rock, to a woman with a different way of saying August, to a life not threaded by whistles. He said his brother had come back once with a look about him like a train had passed close enough to set his coat flapping. He said the brother had stood in the field at 2:13 and let the light roll over him, and then he had nodded at a distance like a conductor respecting another man's line. He said the brother had gone back to Little Rock and never quite found sleep at that hour again. He said the brother had died in a chair with the television on and his mouth open, and when they found him, his hands were set the way men hold onto rails when the car starts to move. Mr. Durham said he did not tell me that before because he did not think of it as a warning. He thought of it as a way to describe what a thing can do to a man when it knows his name. That night, before I drove back to Dallas, I stood at the edge of the field with a thermos of coffee that tasted like that first cup your father pours in a hunting blind when the cold is more of a proof than a condition. The light came from my right going to my left the way it always does, a rebellion that made its own tradition. I did not wave. I stayed still. I said the names of people I loved under my breath, not because I wanted to keep them from being called, but because names are a way to keep time on your own when the world insists on setting a clock for you. When the light had gone, I walked the right of way to the pine and stood on the rectangle of ballast and felt the ear pop and did not fear it. I set the spike down in the center, a payment in the currency of men who dare to pick up what used to be nailed down. I told the air that I understood the need to keep to a schedule. I told it I would not stand in the way. I told it if it ever called the boy again not to make him walk. The wind lifted and set like a breath drawn by something that has learned patience. Across the field, a thin chain of light from the highway pulsed red like a heart that knows the work ahead. I listened to the long, low murmur of a machine that remembers being needed, and understood that my father had not loved trains the way I thought he had. He had loved the part of the world that agrees to become a path and then makes itself ready, year after year, for whatever must come through. He had loved the habit of answering present. The whistle had not taken him. He had stepped into a place that honored the man he thought he was when he said things like sound remembers. He had joined a roll call that needed a voice with the right sand in it. Now when people ask me about home and I say Texarkana, I tell them we had a train that kept better time dead than most living men keep at their jobs. I tell them not to wave. I tell them if they hear a whistle at 2:13 they should stand still and let the sound pass through their bones and do the work it came to do. If I like them, I tell them about a boy with a jacket. If I love them, I do not. When August comes, the air goes a little tight. And in whatever apartment I have managed to afford, I wake and listen and hear the list. And in it, I always hear one name with a smile wrapped around it, like a tie pulled a little loose at the end of a day. Present, my father says. On board, I say nothing. I stand at my own window in the city or the town, and I let the light pass, and I keep my hands at my sides. Sometimes when I am certain I am the only one awake, I answer in my chest with a word so soft even the air cannot keep it. Here, here, here. The mansion stood on the far edge of Tyler, half swallowed by a grove of blackened pine trees. Locals called it the Holbrook Estate, though most of them couldn't remember who the Holbrooks were. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to rot under Texas storms and summer heat. People who wandered too close swore they saw candlelight flicker through the upper windows, but when police checked, they always found nothing but dust and raccoons. Still, there was one room no one stayed in for long, the ballroom lined entirely with mirrors. I didn't believe any of it until last spring. I was hired to photograph old structures for a preservation project. When I reached the Holbrook mansion, I found the front door hanging open as if it had been waiting for me. The air inside was dry, thick with rot and the faint metallic sting of something like blood. The walls were stripped of wallpaper, the floors warped. But there was a strange chill that didn't belong in late May. I walked through with my camera, shooting every corner. The house was ordinary enough until I reached the grand hall. The double doors to the ballroom were half cracked. When I pushed them open, light from the setting sun streamed in through tall, dust-streaked windows and scattered off the mirrors that covered every wall. There must have been hundreds, some full panels, others fragmented and chipped. Yet somehow they all caught the light just right, so the entire room shimmered as if underwater. I could see myself reflected 100 times over. Each angle slightly warped, faces bending and twisting. The first thing I noticed was that the reflections didn't match perfectly. I lifted my camera, adjusted my stance, and noticed that my reflection in the center mirror lagged behind by half a second. It was subtle, like a skipped video frame, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I tested it again, raised my hand, waved, and my reflection followed just a heartbeat late. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to exhaustion or tricks of the light. But when I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. One of the reflections, just barely within sight, smiled. Not a nervous or friendly smile, but a slow, deliberate one that didn't belong to me. My own face was still, but the one in the mirror grinned wide enough to show teeth. My chest tightened. I spun around, flashlight beam bouncing across the room, but every reflection snapped back into place, perfectly synchronized again. I told myself I imagined it. The air in there did something strange. It felt denser, almost heavy, as if it didn't want sound to travel. When I spoke my own name under my breath, it came back to me slightly delayed, an echo that didn't sound quite right. Still, I kept photographing. Curiosity always outruns fear in me, and I figured this was just a weird acoustic illusion. When I developed the first few shots on my portable setup, my stomach dropped. In every image, the reflection of myself was facing the wrong direction. In one, I was turned toward the door, but the reflection faced into the room. In another, my body was still, but my mirrored counterpart appeared mid-step. I deleted the files, assuming camera glitch, and took a few more. But the new ones were worse. In the final image, something stood behind me in the reflection. Tall, human-shaped. Its head bent at an unnatural angle, face smeared into a blur. I whipped around, the sound of my heartbeat filling my ears, but the room was empty. Only my reflection stared back, eyes wide and trembling. I packed my gear fast, but before I could reach the door, it slammed shut hard enough to rattle the mirrors. My flashlight flickered and went out. The only light came from the fading sunset outside, and as it dimmed, the room seemed to grow darker faster than it should have. My reflection didn't move when I did this time. It just stood still, hands by its side, watching me with a blank expression. Then slowly it began to lift one arm, not in sync with mine, but on its own. The sound that followed was faint, like nails dragging down glass. Every mirror in the room shuddered. I stumbled backward, tripping over my bag. When I landed, the reflections around me no longer matched reality. Some of them were walking closer. Others stood still, their eyes locked on me from impossible angles. I blinked, and one reflection was suddenly right in front of me, separated by only the glass. It leaned closer. I could see my own terrified face, except it wasn't mine anymore. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth too wide. I heard the faintest whisper, a voice that sounded like mine but lower, like it had been buried in static. "Stay," it said. "We've missed you." I bolted for the door, hitting it again and again until the handle gave. When it finally burst open, I didn't look back. I ran down the hall, out through the porch, and didn't stop until I was halfway down the dirt road toward town. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those mirrors, the way the reflections lagged, the faces twisting behind the glass. A week later, the photos reappeared on my camera's SD card. I had formatted it twice, but there they were, sharper than before. And in the newest one, a photo I know I didn't take, the ballroom looked cleaner, almost restored. The chandeliers were lit and people filled the room. But their faces were mine. Dozens of me smiling, dancing, watching from behind the glass. I stopped sleeping altogether after that. I smashed my camera, sold my equipment, and moved out of Tyler. But no matter where I go, I keep catching glimpses of something reflective watching me. In windows, in puddles, even in the screen of my phone when it's off. Sometimes when I move, it doesn't. And when I smile to test it, I swear it smiles just a little too wide, just a little too long, as if it knows I can't leave the mirror room behind. The Blackwell School sat alone on the edge of Marfa, its brick walls faded by the desert sun, its windows like dead eyes staring across the endless scrubland. Time had forgotten the building, but it hadn't forgotten what happened inside. The place had once been filled with laughter, chalk dust, and the sound of children reciting lessons in Spanish before being corrected, sternly, to use English. That was decades ago, when the school still stood as a segregated institution for Mexican-American children. Now only the wind spoke there, and sometimes on quiet nights, it carried other sounds, whispers, chalk scratching, faint echoes of lessons that should have ended long ago. Linda Carrington didn't believe any of it. She was a teacher, practical to her core, the kind of woman who corrected superstition with facts and didn't flinch when the wind rattled old windows. She'd moved to Marfa from Austin for a quieter life, and had joined a small preservation group trying to restore historic buildings in the area. When the group proposed restoring Blackwell as a cultural museum, she volunteered to oversee it. The others seemed relieved she was willing, too relieved. Her first day at the site was hotter than she expected, the kind of heat that made the metal door handles too hot to touch. She had to wedge the main doors open with a rock. Inside, the air was stale and heavy like a room sealed for years. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk and dust, though the blackboards were clean. The old desks stood in uneven rows, as if waiting for children who would never return. She began by documenting the layout for the renovation report. Main hallway, 4 classrooms, small office at the back. The first few hours passed uneventfully until she reached the second classroom. The door stuck halfway open, swollen from years of humidity. When she pushed harder, it gave way with a groan that echoed down the hall. She switched on her flashlight and caught sight of something faint across the chalkboard. Words written in looping cursive. No debemos olvidar. We must not forget. She froze. The chalk was white and fresh, not powdery like the old sticks she'd found scattered around the room. The letters looked newly drawn. She took a step back, then laughed quietly to herself. Probably someone from the Historical Society had come earlier to write it as a gesture of remembrance. Still, she took a photo for her notes. That night, she reviewed the pictures in her motel room. The board was clean in the first photo she'd taken earlier that morning before lunch. The words only appeared in the later one. She frowned but brushed it off. Marfa had its share of pranksters, and she figured someone must have slipped in while she was outside taking measurements. The next morning, she arrived early, before sunrise, to avoid the heat. The air was cool and the horizon glowed faintly orange. As she unlocked the main door, she heard a soft scraping sound inside. Her hand froze on the handle. It stopped as soon as the hinges creaked. She stepped in, her flashlight beam slicing through the dim. Nothing, just the usual emptiness. She checked each classroom. Everything was still until she reached the second one again. This time the words had changed. The phrase now read, "Todavía estamos aquí, we are still here." She felt her stomach drop. The handwriting was the same as before, childlike, careful. The chalk was broken in half, sitting on the ledge beneath the board. She stared at it, half expecting to see someone hiding behind the desks. When she stepped closer, she felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The air felt heavier. Her breath fogged faintly in the beam of her flashlight. Linda backed out slowly and shut the door. She locked it from the outside, though she wasn't sure why. Logic told her it was probably just a prank again, maybe kids from town. Still, she called the project manager, a local named Hank, and told him what she'd found. "Yeah, you might see that," Hank said over the phone. "The folks around here talk about it sometimes. Kids writing showing up on the boards like the old students coming back. Nobody's ever caught who's doing it." "You sound like you believe it," she said. He hesitated. "I believe the desert holds on to things. Heat, sound, memory. Sometimes it plays them back." That night, Linda couldn't sleep. She dreamed of a classroom full of children sitting at old wooden desks, their faces blurred like fogged glass. A tall man in a gray suit stood at the front, his mouth moving though no sound came. The children copied something from the board in unison. When she looked at their notebooks, the words weren't English or Spanish, but something she didn't recognize. Letters looping endlessly, forming no language at all. When the man turned toward her, his face was gone, just a smooth, blank surface. She woke gasping. The next day, she brought a small camera to set up overnight, determined to catch whoever was behind the writings. She placed it in the second classroom, aimed directly at the chalkboard. The building was silent as she left, her footsteps echoing across the empty hall. That evening, the wind picked up hard across the desert, rattling the motel windows. She couldn't stop thinking about that phrase, "We are still here." When she finally slept, her dreams were filled with whispering voices, overlapping, hundreds of them, all speaking at once, all too quiet to understand. She woke before dawn and drove back to the school. The sun was barely rising when she unlocked the doors. Inside, the air was thick again, cooler than outside, the silence pressing in like a weight. When she reached the classroom, her flashlight beam caught the board, and she froze. The chalk writing covered every inch now. Dozens of names written in small, neat letters. Children's names: Maria, Jorge, Luz, Hector, Sofia. Some had been crossed out. Others were written again, smaller, below the first. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and something else, burnt wood. She backed toward the camera, trying not to look away from the board. The red light on the camera was blinking, still recording. She turned it off, her hands trembling, and replayed the footage on the small screen. At first it showed nothing but stillness. Then sometime around 2:17 a.m., the chalk began to move on its own. Slow, careful letters forming one by one. The stick of chalk rolled across the ledge, paused, then rose slightly as if held by invisible fingers. Linda felt her throat close. The handwriting continued until it filled the board. Then faintly the camera's microphone picked up something. Soft, distant voices, children reciting a pledge. Not the Pledge of Allegiance, but something older, rhythmic. The last line was clear: "We will not be erased." Her hand shook so badly she almost dropped the camera. She backed out of the room, her breath coming in short bursts. She didn't remember locking the doors or even getting into her truck, but by the time she looked up again, she was halfway back to town. Later that day, she called Hank again, voice trembling. "We need to shut it down. That place isn't right," he sighed heavily. "I told you. Some things stay behind. Those kids, they were punished for speaking Spanish. Made to forget their names, their songs. Maybe they're still trying to be heard. I saw it. Hank, the chalk was writing itself." He paused a long time before saying, "Then you're one of the few who's seen what they really want to say." Linda didn't go back for 2 days. She wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, that she'd imagined it all, but the footage was still on the camera. She'd watched it a dozen times, each viewing leaving her more certain it wasn't a trick. Finally, she decided she had to go back once more. Close things up, return the keys, and end her part in the project. When she arrived that final morning, the school seemed different. The light coming through the dusty windows looked dimmer, more yellow. The air was almost humming, like distant singing. As she walked down the hallway, she realized it was coming from inside the second classroom. A soft chorus of children's voices. Her hand trembled as she opened the door. Inside, every desk was filled. Faint outlines sat there, shapes of children drawn from dust and light, all facing the front of the room. The teacher stood before them, the same faceless man from her dream. His hand moved across the board with invisible chalk, spelling out a sentence that formed slowly, one word at a time. "Write your names, Miss Carrington." She stumbled back, hitting the doorframe. Her name appeared on the board beneath the others, forming letter by letter, the chalk moving steadily. Lindacarrington. She screamed, turned, and ran. She didn't stop until she reached her truck. As she started the engine, she looked up once more through the cracked windshield. The classroom window glowed faintly, and for a moment, she thought she saw small hands pressed against the glass, as if waving goodbye or calling her back. She left Marfa that afternoon and never returned. The footage was sent to the Preservation Committee anonymously. They closed the project soon after, citing unresolved concerns. Locals say the Blackwell School still stands quiet at the edge of town, waiting. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, the faint sound of children reciting lessons drifts through the desert air, and every few months someone passing by at night swears they see the windows glowing faintly, chalk dust swirling inside, and new names written on the board that no one dares to read. I took the site after midnight because that was when the phone stopped ringing and the city lowered its voice. Old Fort Worth at that hour is like a stage after the audience has left. The brick streets hold the day's heat, the street lamps hum, and somewhere out near the Trinity you can hear a train pushing its weight over the rails. They call this part of town the Old District because it remembers things. You can walk past the stockyards and smell cut rope and creosote. When there is no rope and no railcar in sight, the mule alley arches brood. The neon at the hotel sign buzzes like a wasp in a jar. There are plaques about cattle and oilmen, and if you stand too long reading them, you might feel as if the words have started reading you back. I told myself all that was just tiredness. It got into my bones the way the wind does under a thin jacket. It was my third week on nights. The company gave me a key ring that rattled like a tambourine and a map printed big, every building boxed and numbered, every checkpoint a little square with a line through it. Start on Exchange Avenue, loop the pens, check the alley entries, the museum annex, the boarded storefront that used to be a bar but lost its lease. Sign off by 4 and clock out. In the daylight, it would have felt like nothing. At night, the space between doors is longer than it should be. Even the pigeons go quiet. The bars close, the college kids evaporate, and you can hear your own keys echo. The first time I heard the piano, I thought it was some night owl working a Bluetooth speaker behind one of the locked doors. The time on my phone read 3:03 a.m. The sound drifted soft and tinny like it was being played through water. A rag and then a waltz, hesitant at first and then confident as if the fingers had to remember the path. The song threaded the air in that narrow block where the brick arches lean over and the street narrows before it widens again. It was cold enough that my breath showed, and then there was smoke. Not the sour ghost of a cigarette, but cigar smoke, thick and sweet, the kind an old man might buy with his last bit of pride. It came from nowhere you could point at. I stood there stupid with it, and by the time I walked to the alley, the sound was gone. The street was empty. The brick held its heat. My radio hissed and then behaved itself. I logged it as nuisance noise and kept to my route. The second night it happened again and I knew better. I checked the doors earlier. I did the pens in the museum annex and I cut 15 minutes off my loop to be in that block at exactly 3. The time on my phone ticked to 3 and the street held its breath. The wind had some grit in it. A big banner slapped against its ropes over the street, rattling the hooks. Then the first notes rolled out soft and lonely, like a conversation you are not supposed to hear. It was a piano that had seen hard years, a saloon piano. Its octaves not quite true, a faint rattle in the high keys. I smelled cigar smoke again, and underneath it a faint varnish smell, a sweetness that made me think of furniture polish and something else that did not have a name, the way old lacquer smells when heat wakes it. It was so distinct that I stepped closer and put my hand on the cold glass of a dark window, where a boutique had hung closed signs for the season. The glass held my face in the reflection of the streetlight. For a second I thought I saw a second reflection behind mine, a lot of brim shadow and a collar up over the chin, but when I moved it did not move. Then the notes tripped and the reflection diluted into a shadow on the glass and the music drifted on. The only other guard on nights that week was an older guy named Manny who did the far side of the district. He had been on this site long enough to know where every board had a loose nail. Over coffee in the shack just before 2, I told him I kept hearing music on Exchange and asked if there was a club operating late. He stared at his paper cup the way men do when they do not want to laugh. They call it the silent street, he said. He told me it always starts at 3. He said if you smell cigar smoke, you need to keep your eyes on the pavement, and you need to remember that smell because it is telling you where you are standing. I asked what he meant and he picked lint off his coat sleeve. A saloon burned down there in 1910. A lot of places burned in this town when it wanted to see itself new. This one took a handful of men and one girl they said ran drinks from the kitchen because the bartender was drunk. The newspapers called it an unfortunate incident. You can look up the name if you like. Folks stopped saying it out loud after a while. I asked if he had heard the piano. He said he had never made a point of being there at 3. He said some things asked to be left alone. He was not scolding. He was tired. He had been 80% retired for as long as anyone remembered. He pushed his cup toward the trash. If you have to go, go with your eyes open, he said. The trick is to know when something older than you expects an answer. The third night I parked the questions and the rules both. I went. The sky was low and moving fast. The streetlights dragged their halos the way they do when mist stands up from the river. The bricks of the street were the color of dried blood and damp clay. A stray dog trotted past me without seeing me. The neon at the Stockyards Hotel sighed. The time on my phone ticked to 2:59 and then to 3:00. The piano began as if it had always been playing and I had just moved into range. It was not background anymore. It was in front of me. The notes fattened by wood and the hollowness of a big room with too many bodies and not enough windows. I could hear the bench creak. I could feel the way your fingers tingle when you rub them across old ivory. I followed the sound to the narrowest place where the storefronts bend toward each other, and where the fire from 1910 would have flung heat from wall to wall like a held breath. The cigar smoke came on, patient and old. It smelled like my grandfather's jacket when I was a child. That mix of winter wind and tobacco leaf and wool that had known rain. My eyes watered, and when I wiped them, I noticed the black smears on my fingers. Soot. I told myself a delivery truck had passed and coughed. I told myself a lot of things. The alley that runs off that block is mostly used now for service entries and trash day, a place for cans and the wonky gates that always drift open. At the mouth of it, there is a slice of old wall that was never properly cleaned after whatever building once attached to it was knocked down. The brick there is darker, and when your flashlight runs over it, you see a tide mark about shoulder height where the black gives way to red. I had run my light over it a dozen times while checking locks. Tonight the beam slid over and showed me lines in the grime. Someone had traced a rectangle with a steady hand in the soot. Inside the rectangle, in small, careful letters, someone had written a name. Not written exactly. Revealed, the way a child writes with a finger in a dirty car window. The letters stood clean against the black. The name was Ada. I do not know why that made my scalp tighten. It is not a rare name. It is only letters. I scrubbed my sleeve across them until the black ran back over the red and the letters went away. The piano stumbled, a trip of 3 notes like someone losing a step in the dark. I stepped back into the street. A figure was standing under the gaslight that is not a gaslight anymore. He had the posture of a man who has looked at a lot of floors. He wore a hat the way men do when the hat is the last decent thing they own. He held a cigar he was not smoking. The smoke came off it anyway in a straight line like a seam. His coat was shinier on the sleeves than the body. He looked like a photograph someone had walked out of. The part of my brain that handles policy said you are alone, and it is 3 and you need to be smart. The part of my brain that had grown up around men who wore their Sundays thin said hello before I could stop it. He nodded as if that was the correct word. He looked at my keys and then passed me toward the alley, and then he said a thing in a careful voice. He said, "You are late, pianist." He said it like a joke that had lived its whole life and found no laughter. You can pretend a lot in 3 seconds. I told myself he was a reenactor or a drunk or an actor hired for some viral campaign. I even had a little thrill that it might be a prank and someone would jump out with a camera. Then the wind shifted and the world changed its weight. The electric hum of the street lamps fell away. The neon failed. The cold stepped closer and then stepped back. I heard the boom that big doors make when someone runs through them. I heard chairs scrape. I heard a woman say, "Bring more ice," and a man laugh too hard. I did not step voluntarily, but I stepped. The brick under my boots was the same brick as it had been, but the edges felt rounder, worn by feet that had lived while mine had not. The alley no longer held cans. It held rain barrels. The wall that had been stained now wore posters, and one poster had a girl drawn on it with a bow at her throat. The street was full, and I had been standing in it without getting run down, which is how you know you are not in the center of the story yet. The saloon was where the boarded boutique sits. It was as if the years had bent around it without breaking its spine. Doors swung. A piano stood with its back to the street so the soundboard could throw music into the room. A mirror ran the length of the far wall, blotched like skin that has seen too much sun. Men stood 3 deep and held glass like it was good news. A girl with a white apron edged past me with a tray of beers, and she was not a ghost. I felt the bump of her hip against mine, and I felt her say sorry without her lips moving. The pianist sat with his shoulders high as if he expected a touch between them, and his hands made loops without a page to hold them to a particular tune. He wore a vest with small buttons and a wedding ring that was too loose. His hairline admitted the future. He looked like every man who ran out of choices and learned to pretend he had not. He swung into a rag, and I knew it, though I could not name it. I knew where the hard part came. The little 4-note thing that trips you if you are tired, and just as he reached it, I felt the oddest sensation, like a room moving under me. My hands were on the keys. The bench creaked under a weight I did not recognize, and at the same time recognized completely. I smelled my own sweat, and it brought with it my father's knuckles on a Sunday table after church when the radio was too loud. The loop of what is and what was came together, and I was caught in the notch. I looked in the mirror and did not see myself. I saw the pianist's back and his hands and the careful tilt of his head when he listened for a laugh behind him, because the piece he chose was meant to please a particular man. I turned my head, and my reflection turned its, and somewhere nearby a cigar burned without help and made a thin sword of smoke up toward the coffered ceiling. The man with the hat and the straight smoke leaned on the bar with his eyes lightly shut, not asleep but remembering something he liked better than the present. The girl in the apron set down beers and called to someone in the kitchen for more ice. The bartender wiped and wiped a dry glass. When he stopped wiping, I saw his fingers were shaking. You can be in the middle of a thing and refuse to understand it. That is a human gift. I clung to it like a drowning man to a post. A man at the end of the bar raised his glass and said to no one in particular that the town was going to rise. He said oil and cattle would make it grander than Dallas. Someone booed Dallas on principle, and they laughed, and the laughter rolled and made warm pockets of air above the tables. The mirror gathered it all and made more of it than there was. The pianist's hand slipped on that same 4-note run, and the mirror caught that too. The man in the hat opened his eyes and watched the pianist's fingers. He took the cigar out of his mouth. He put it back. The girl in the apron stepped away, and her shoe caught a nail, and for one heartbeat the room waited to see if she would fall, and then she did not. That was the moment when the door on the alley banged twice and the piano's bass strings thudded as if a hand had hit them, and the hard varnish smell rose, not sweet anymore, but angry. It climbed the walls and crawled along the mirror and found all the people in the room and chose which ones it wanted. The bartender said something obscene and dropped the glass. He looked toward the door where the alley should be. A coil of smoke came under that door like lace, delicate and wrong. The girl in the apron looked at the floor, not at the door, and set her hands on her hips, and there was a mathematical instant in which I saw her understand both her life and its upset. She turned toward the kitchen. She was going for ice. That is what people do with fire before they know its name. The man in the hat blew out a thin stream and said, "Now," and it was not something you say when you are pleased. The piano went on. I could not stop it. The bench held me, and the keys asked for the next run and the next. And the music rose because the human brain begs for pattern while it burns. Heat pressed the back of my neck. I knew there were sets of steps behind me, and I knew which ones were not going to reach the street. The mirror fogged at its far end and brightened where it was nearest to the door as if the light there wanted to live. The hats on the hooks along the wall began to steam at their brims. The bartender shouted to empty the barrels, and his voice broke. Smoke turned the air into a kind of glass. I watched the girl pass me, and I felt the draft of her apron. I wanted to stand. I wanted to grab her sleeve. I played the 4 notes and felt my hand get them right for once. I thought if I missed, I could break whatever this was. My hands did not miss. They were good hands, and they wanted to show off for the man in the hat, and for the part of me that is weak. The alley door heaved inward. Heat said its word, and the mirror gave up. It went in a ripple, not shattering so much as shrugging itself into a different shape. The pianist in the glass looked at me, and I saw, not the man in the vest, but my own face, the way I look when I try to appear unafraid for someone who needs me to be. In that waver, I knew the loop was fixed long before I stepped into it. I was not there to prevent anything. I was there to make the music that held the moment in its shape. A hand came down on my shoulder. The man in the hat leaned and said, "Your soft notes are better than your loud ones," and it was almost fond. The way you talk to a nephew about a habit he cannot fix." He steered me to the right. Together we slid off the bench. He put the cigar in my hand and its coal burned without eating. He was smiling, or his mouth was doing something that had practiced being a smile. "That door," he said. "The one that wakes up." We went to the alley. The air there had more teeth. He put my palm to the place on the wall where the soot line still was in my time. The brick was hot enough that I thought the skin would stick, and it did, and I pulled away and left something behind. He told me to leave my handprint and say the name of the girl and go find what needed to be found. I told him he was not making sense. He took the cigar back. He pointed to the floor. A brass key tag lay in the crack between boards. It had a number and a curl of lettering that my eyes would later read as The Silent Street. The number was 12. It was warm when I picked it up. He said it again, slower, like to a man waking from anesthesia. "The brick knows what you are. It will let you through. Say her name and press your palm there and be done with it." The smoke in the alley blew sideways, and I saw fire in the kitchen door behind the girl. It had the bright look of a dog that knows the hand it is about to bite. The bartender yelled and a man fell, and the music from the other room kept going without me, as if it had fingers of its own. The man in the hat put my hand to the wall. The heat hurt, but I do not know if you can call that kind of hurt anything you can put in a doctor's book. I said the girl's name because he had told me to. Ada. The brick flexed under my palm the way ribs do when someone is breathing too fast. For 1 second I thought I had made a child's mistake, that this was a hallucination built from a plaque and a story, and a nervous shift worker and too much coffee. Then the brick gave and my hand went into the wrist and the heat came up my arm, and then it was gone. When I pulled back there was black on my palm, and the shape of my hand stayed on the wall as if I had pressed it there in a different century. The man in the hat said, "Now you know where the door is. Now you can go back through it when you need to." He looked past me toward the sound in the other room, and for the first time I saw not patience but grief. It was deep and tired, and it had had nothing to feed on for a long time but itself. The world turned back. It did it the way a coin turns in your fingers if you have done the trick a lot. The sound of electric lights came back, the hard white press of sodium and the neat hum of transformers, the far-off train and the flapping banner and the empty street. The boutique windows were back with their taped X's. The alley held cans again. The soot line on the wall was only a stain. The time on my phone read 3:07. The cigar smell thinned to nothing and then blew away. My palm still had the black on it. A brass tag with the number 12 lay in the cracks between bricks where there had never been floorboards. I picked it up. It was too warm for a thing that had lived in the cold. When I turned it over, it read The Silent Street. The letters were worn smooth by hands that had had more labor in them than mine. I did not tell Manny. I slept the next day and dreamed I had taken a door handle in my hand, and it had turned into the neck of a child. I woke with my heart doing double time and the smell of varnish in my pillow. That night I told myself I would not go down that block. I did my route crooked and cut across the pens and past the museum annex and pretended paperwork. At 2:59 the world grew still anyway. This time the piano started and I could not pretend it was any other thing. I went, because something in the way the keys landed asked me to. You can call that compulsion. I call it politeness to a tune, you know. The handprint I had left on the alley wall was plain at 2 a.m., but when the piano began it was gone. The soot line smoothed itself. The bricks pulsed as if underwater. I put my palm there, and the heat reached for me like someone grasping a wrist in the dark. I went through and found myself in the alley that did not yet have cans. The man in the hat was not there. The girl was. She was kneeling beside a bucket that had been full of ice when the night began. The ice had turned to water and the water was warm to the touch. She was crying without sound. There was a quality to it that makes men like me feel gangly and stupid. I said her name and she looked at me as if we had met yesterday. I told her to go out to the street. I told her not to go through the kitchen. She shook her head no, but her feet did what they were told. Even now I do not know if the rules in that place allowed anything to change. Maybe all a man can do is move where bodies will be found. We went out into the saloon. The mirror was still whole. The men were in the positions they had held the night before, likes in a photograph you have stared at. The man in the hat stood where he had stood, watching a door even though he wore the face of a man who thinks he is watching a piano. I tried to make my voice carry in a way the air would accept. "There is a fire in the kitchen," I said. You need to leave." I saw their faces turn and then turn back towards the parts of their lives that mattered more to them than a man talking from an angle they could not hear. The bartender saw me, and for an instant his eyes were like a horse's when the shadow on the ground looks like a hole. He sucked in his cheeks and shouted to the boys to haul the beer into the street. Men got to their feet. The girl's hand was in mine, and she let it be there. A chair scraped. Someone laughed the laugh men use when they want to make work into a joke. The alley door banged and heat exhaled. Then the moment folded along the crease it had folded along every time, and the fire took the air it wanted. You do not know what smoke is until it is inside you and you're trying to move your arms through it. It is not a color. It is weight. It sits on your tongue. The girl pulled free and went the way she had gone before, not because she wanted to repeat herself, but because her life embodied habit. The man in the hat took my elbow again, and this time there was no humor in the gesture. He drew me toward the door, and the door consented. The street laid itself out like a cool cloth. The music went on for a second, as if embarrassed to stop, and then it did. I put my hands on my knees and spit black. The man in the hat leaned his shoulder to the brick, gently, like a man who has been lied to by a doctor but is going to tell his wife the good news anyway. "Thank you for trying," he said. He could have been saying, "I am sorry for what is." The wind came around the corner of the building and slapped the banner, and the street grew modern around us. He looked at my hand. "You might think it is a mistake that it is your handprint there," he said. "You might think you made this or that I did." He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, an old courtesy that the town does not ask for anymore. He said, "Get rest, pianist." He walked away, and he did not cast a shadow that matched the streetlight. What can you do with something like that? You can quit your job. You can drink until you forget. You can turn the key and lock the door and say, "None of it was anything." I did none of those things. I went back the next night, and the night after that. I began to notice what the music did to the street. When the first notes came, the rats went quiet. The pigeons tucked their heads under their wings like children trying to sleep through adults' anger. The neon at the hotel stuttered. The train near the river always blew once then. It was never an hour earlier or later. It was as if the street borrowed air from the whole city. I kept the brass tag in my pocket, and twice it was not there when I reached for it, and then my fingers found it and understood it had never left. I made rubbings of my handprint with notebook paper and a pencil. The print came up crisp. You could count the ridges. On one rubbing there was a mark on the heel of my hand where a scar should have been. The skin there on my actual hand was smooth. I touched it and felt something in me shrug. Manny asked me once if I had seen anything interesting. He asked it without leaning too hard. I said the kids sometimes leave chalk drawings on the alley floor. He said they always do. He had chalk dust on his cuff that he did not notice. I asked if he knew the name Ada. He said his aunt had a friend Ada who ran a pie truck and once drove it into a ditch by the river. He asked why. I told him a plaque somewhere had mentioned it, and he grunted and asked if I had cash for the coffee machine. The last night I worked that post, the wind came from the north and the sky carried grit from farther than a man should try to imagine. The city had been spooked all day. People argued and honked and then apologized at lights. You can feel when a place is working around something. I walked my route and the brick felt like it had a fever. I went to the block at 3 as if obeying a schedule I had written with my own hand. The music started in that polite way it has, making a door where there is none. I put my hand on the alley wall and stepped in. The man in the hat was waiting with his attention on something that was not me. He took the cigar out of his mouth and said, "Tonight." I did not know if he meant it as a promise or a sentence. I went in through the saloon doors and the mirror caught me, and losing myself felt like relief. The girl made her circuit and smiled at no one, or maybe at me in a place where I could not receive it. The bartender stacked glass. The men bragged about cattle. The piano waited to make its 4-note mistake. I sat down because the story wanted me to, and because I wanted to be its instrument. The first 8 bars came clean. The next 4 made the room lean. When I got to the treble, I did not think about hands. I thought about smoke and the weight of it, about girls and their habit of going where they have gone, about men who have learned to pretend through disaster, I thought about the brass tag heavy in my pocket and the soot on the wall with my hand. The run came and I missed on purpose. I stopped. Put your hands up when you are not supposed to and the world notices you. The bench creaked in confusion. The men at the bar made a noise. The girl paused and 3 of the beers on her tray slid toward each other and did not quite kiss. The man in the hat said, "If you stop the song, you stop the street." And he did not say it with anger or admiration. He said it the way you say the weather. The alley door opened like a mouth. The heat came and this time I heard water hit it. It sounded like applause for the wrong play. I stood and I went to the girl and I put my hand on her wrist. I said her name. I pulled her toward the front door. The men made way in a channel they did not know they were forming. The mirror gave me back my own face for a breath. And in that breath I saw a thing that was not there before. There was a boy in the corner, eyes wide, his hands planted on his knees. The son of someone who thought tonight would be a good night for a little excitement. He was not supposed to be there. I knew him because he was me. He did not exist in any story but mine. He had my ears. He had my frightened pride. He saw me see him and stood, and then the heat took the place where he had been, and the mirror popped louder than a pistol. The girl ran toward the street. The bartender came dragging a man by the elbow and both of them fell. The man in the hat was at the door with his mouth turned down. He looked like a judge who has handled the same case too many times. I tried to go to the boy. I lost my footing. The floor had opinions. Smoke lifted me by the roof of my mouth. My eyes watered so hard I could not see. A hand closed on my collar. The man in the hat pulled me into the alley. We stood with our backs to the brick like sinners in a storm. The street opened long and empty. The piano played by itself for a second, and then someone struck its side and the strings answered with a horrible, lovely roar, and then there was only the shy hiss of heat settling its bill. The man in the hat did not look at me. He looked at the alley wall where my handprint did not yet exist. He said you execute it every time as if it were new. He said if you did not, the street would grow quiet in a way you cannot forgive. He put the cigar back in his mouth. He let it hang there without firing, and it smoked anyway. He reached into his coat and took out a matchbook and held it up in the glow from nothing. The cover read The Silent Street, in a font you could only make by hand. He tucked it into my palm. He said, "Now you will bring the smell with you wherever you go." He took his fingers to the brim of his hat and stepped back through a seam of air I could not see. I was alone with electric light. On my last day after I turned in my keys and signed the form that said I had not been injured on site, I walked Exchange in the daylight and stood in front of the boutique where the saloon is and was. The window showed me my face in the shape of an interior that sold expensive denim. The alley held its cans and a damp mat waiting for pickup. I went to the soot line and put my hand there. The brick was just brick. A kid on a scooter went by singing under his breath, and the song was not the waltz. I walked to the river and watched a barge nose down the wide water, and the wind smelled like cold dirt in far places. When I got home, I emptied my pockets on the kitchen table. The brass tag lay there with its smooth edges. The matchbook lay beside it, old but not crumbling, as if it had been waiting on a shelf. I opened it. Inside were no matches. On the inside of the cover, in a woman's careful block letters, it said, "Come around back if no one answers." I closed it and set it down, and my palm left a small black crescent on the white cardboard of a pizza flyer underneath. It felt like a joke between me and a street. It felt like a promise. I thought I would sleep better once I left the site.
I did not.
Some nights I wake at 2:50 and lie there counting the seconds as if the world owes me a siren at 3. Sometimes I smell cigars in apartment hallways that have never known tobacco. Once on a downtown sidewalk I heard the faint rattle of a worn octave, and I turned and saw no one. Only a pane of glass and my own face floating in it like something for sale. I do not tell this to people who look at me for guidance. I tell them about locks and doors and where the homeless will bed down, and how to ask them to move without making your life longer than it has to be. I tell them to be friendly to the cops and kinder to the barbacks. I tell them to make sure they keep batteries in the radio. I do not tell them that the city has a clock you cannot see that strikes at 3 and tunes itself to a piano older than sense. I do not tell them that sometimes the loop shows you a person who did not belong in it until you watched him learn he did. When I walk past that block now, even in daylight, I feel my shoulder want to hunch the way the pianist held his. I am not a religious man, but I speak a name under my breath the way a man might recite from a book he no longer believes in, but still respects. I say Ada quiet. I put my hand in my pocket and feel the tag and the matchbook. I tell myself that the street is not asking anything of me, and that this is only a story in a town that sells them. At night, though, when the trains run and the river breathes and neon sighs, I know better. There is a point on Exchange where the wind stands still, and at that point the smoke has a right to you. If you stand there at 3, you will hear what I hear, and if you do it long enough, you will hear the one mistake that carries everything else. If you are very attentive, you will notice when it is me playing and when it is the other man. On those nights, you will smell cigar smoke and think of your grandfather, or a stranger you never met. You will feel your fingerprints itch. You will look at a piece of glass and watch it watch you. The trick, if there is one, is not to ask for justice, because justice is a day phenomenon. The night has use for repetition. It is a machine that runs on songs you already know. Some places keep their dead in the ground and some keep them in their habits. In Fort Worth, the dead have a piano and a door that turns soft if you are polite to it. I do not live far, and even from here I can feel when the street calls. The music comes thin as ribbon through the vents and rides the air conditioner's side to my bed. I do not get up when it does. I lie there and count the skip in the 4 notes and tell myself I missed them on purpose once, and that something changed. Then the wind moves and tells me I am lying, and when the smell reaches me, I answer to my other name, the one the man in the hat uses, and I am back on that bench, and the mirror is warping, and the girl is passing with a tray, and the piano asks, as it always asks, whether I would like to keep playing. If you walk there at 3 and you hear me, know that I am there and that I am not. Know that the smell comes from no one and from you. Know that the silent street is only quiet when it has everything it needs.